Bram Kessler didn't knock. He never knocked anymore. He pushed open the door to Silver Crown's main office like a man who already owned the place, dropped a thick stack of papers onto Vivian Harroway's desk, and smiled the way a wolf smiles when it has finally cornered something smaller than itself. "Sign these," he said. "Operational transfer. Effective immediately." Vivian stared at him. "You're fired, Bram." He laughed. Actually laughed slow and comfortable, the kind of laugh that doesn't need an audience. "That's real sweet, Miss Harroway. Sign the papers. Get out of my ranch." He leaned down, both palms flat on her desk, close enough that she could smell tobacco and something colder underneath it. "Your ranch," he said quietly, "needs me a whole lot more than it needs you. If you've never seen a wealthy woman lose everything without leaving her own property, stay with me, because this story is going to show you exactly how it happens and exactly how she fights her way back. So subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss a single part of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and your country. I want to see how far this story has already traveled. Now let's go back to Red Willow Valley, Wyoming Territory, and the morning that changed everything. Vivian Harroway had not slept the night before she fired Bram Kessler. She had sat at her father's old desk, her desk now. She kept reminding herself, her desk going through ledger after ledger, until the lamp oil ran low and the numbers stopped making sense. 3 months since Edmund Harroway died. 3 months since she had taken formal possession of Silver Crown Ranch, its 800 cattle, its water rights, its railroad investments, its debts, and its reputation as the strongest operation in Red Willow Valley. 3 months of watching the man her father trusted slowly, methodically, and with absolute confidence, make her invisible inside her own home. She had rehearsed the conversation a dozen times while the candle burned down. "Keep it short. Keep it formal. Don't let him see your hands shake." Her hands shook anyway. "You can't fire me," Bram said again, still smiling, still leaning over her desk like she was a child who had made a mistake with her arithmetic. "Half this crew has been with me 12 years. Your daddy hired me when you were still in finishing school back east. You know how many of these hands even know your name?" "They'll learn it," Vivian said. "Sure they will." He picked up the transfer papers she hadn't signed and folded them carefully, like a man who had all the patience in the world. "You've got 2, maybe 3 days before the suppliers cut you off. I've already spoken with Hatch at the feed store. I've spoken with the Delaney brothers about the water line on the north pasture. I've spoken with Peterson at the Cattlemen's Association." He tucked the papers inside his coat. "They're all very concerned about Silver Crown's management situation." Vivian stood up. "Then they'll be speaking with me directly from now on." Bram looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him making a calculation, deciding whether she was worth arguing with or whether this was already finished. Put on his hat. "Good luck, Miss Harroway." He walked out. By noon, 31 men had collected their pay and left. Vivian stood on the porch of the main house and watched them ride out, wagon after wagon, bedrolls tied to saddles, not one of them looking back. 31 men out of 43. Her foreman, her top hands, her cattle drivers, the men who knew Silver Crown's water gates and fence lines and cattle routes and seasonal patterns the way other men knew their own kitchens. Gone. The head cook, a barrel-shaped woman named Dottie Pierce, who had worked for Edmund Harroway for 20 years, came out and stood beside Vivian on the porch. "Well," Dottie said, watching the last wagon disappear around the tree line. "Don't say it," Vivian said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were about to say something wise, and I'm not ready for it." Dottie went back inside and put on a pot of coffee. The 12 men who stayed were the ones nobody else wanted. 2 old hands who were too slow for Bram's preferred pace. A young wrangler named Pete, who was 19 and didn't fully understand what he'd stayed for. 3 laborers who worked the stock pens and spoke limited English. A bookkeeper named Amos, who was 64, half-blind in one eye, and had been at Silver Crown since before Vivian was born. Cook's assistant, 2 fence repairers, 1 stable hand. Vivian looked at this collection of leftover loyalty and thought, "I own 800 cattle, thousands of acres, and a railroad portfolio that would make most men weep, and this is my army." She went inside and drank her coffee. She did not cry. Not yet. The first sign that something worse was coming arrived 2 days later. Pete, the young wrangler, rode in from the north of pasture, looking like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. Miss Harroway. He pulled up in the yard, horse breathing hard. Those 50 head we moved to the north grass yesterday. They're gone. Vivian came off the porch. What do you mean gone? I mean gone. Fence is cut on the eastern edge. Trail leads toward Beaker's Ridge. He hesitated. Not like they wandered, ma'am. Like somebody moved them. Vivian sent Pete back out with one of the old hands, a leathery man everyone called Shep, who had forgotten more about cattle than most men ever learned. They came back an hour later with the same answer. 50 head, moved deliberately. Trail going east. Vivian rode to town. The feed store Hatches, where Silver Crown had maintained a credit account for 11 years, turned her away before she got through the door. I'm sorry, Miss Harroway. Gerald Hatch had the decency to look uncomfortable. We've had some concerns raised about the account. By whom? I'm not at liberty to, Gerald. My family has spent 11 years buying grain from this store. I understand that. He looked at the floor. I truly do. But until the management question is resolved at Silver Crown, I've been advised by Bram Kessler. Hatch said nothing, which was the same as saying yes. She tried the hardware supplier. Same result. She tried the veterinary supply. The man behind the counter, someone she'd never met before, a replacement for the old clerk who'd known her father, wouldn't even make eye contact. Silver Crown had money. Vivian Harroway personally had more money than everyone in this conversation combined. And not one of them would sell her so much as a spool of wire on account. She rode home through late afternoon, the sky going orange and copper behind the mountains, and let herself be furious the whole way. Not devastated. Furious. There was a difference, and she held on to it. The documents arrived on the 4th day. A lawyer from Casper, not her family's lawyer, someone she'd never seen before, delivered them personally to Silver Crown's front gate with 2 witnesses and a formal seal. Vivian read them on the porch while Pete held the man's horse. The papers claimed that Edmund Harroway, during the final months of his illness, had promised Bram Kessler operational authority over Silver Crown Ranch as compensation for 12 years of loyal service. The documents were signed, witnessed, and notarized. Her father's signature looked real. She stared at it for a long time, trying to find the wrong angle, the tremor, something that didn't match the Edmund Harroway she knew. Couldn't find it. These are fraudulent, she told the lawyer. That will need to be determined by the courts, Miss Harroway. My father would never. I'm simply delivering documents. I have no opinion on their validity. He retrieved his papers, tipped his hat, and left. Vivian sat down on the porch steps and let herself be still for 1 minute. Just one. She counted it in her head. 60 seconds of feeling the full weight of what she was inside. Then she stood up. Pete, she said. Ma'am, how much hay do we have in the south barn? He told her. She made a note. She went to find Amos and started reviewing what was actually left in Silver Crown's operating account versus what the ledgers claimed. She was still working when the storm rolled in that evening. The thunder announced itself about an hour before the rain, a low rumbling from the west that shook the window glass in its frames. By the time the actual storm arrived, it was a genuine Wyoming temperful lightning. Sheets of rain that turned the yard to mud in 20 minutes. Wind that found every gap in the eaves and made the whole house sound like it was arguing with itself. Vivian was sitting at the desk, lamp turned up, comparing feed invoices to herd count records, when she heard the knock. 3 of them. Deliberate, not frantic, despite the weather. Like someone who understood that knocking too hard was a form of panic, and he refused to panic. She didn't call out. She went to the door herself, no butler, no staff for that anymore, and opened it. The man on the porch was soaked through in the first 3 seconds, despite the overhang. Somewhere around 40, she guessed, with the kind of face that didn't give information away easily. A working coat that had been good once. Boots that had covered serious miles. He was holding his hat against his chest, which was the only concession to manners he made, because he was clearly too cold and too tired to perform much more than that. Behind him, and she almost missed this because the rain was heavy and the porch light was poor, something small shifted. Child. pressed against the back of the man's coat like she intended to become part of it, refusing to look at Vivian, face turned sideways against the man's shoulder. "My name is Cade Hollister," the man said. His voice was steady, which she noticed. "I was told in town you might need a rancher." Vivian looked at him. Then at the child behind him, who had still not looked up. "Who told you that?" "Man at the livery," said Silver Crown lost most of its crew. He was right. She studied Cade Hollister's face. "How much experience?" 15 years. "Cattle, horses, water management, fencing, herd movement. Did 2 seasons up north handling drives for the Connor operation out of Cheyenne. Before that, my own spread in Nebraska until..." He stopped. "Until circumstances changed." Vivian waited to see if he'd finish that sentence. He didn't. "Who's the child?" "My daughter, Tilly." He half turned, and his voice changed slightly, just slightly. Barely enough to notice, but it was there. "Tilly, say hello." The girl did not say hello. She pressed harder into his back. "She doesn't talk much," Cade said, facing front again without embarrassment. "She works hard, stays out of the way, and won't cause trouble." Vivian looked at both of them, a weathered cowboy with honest eyes and a soaked bedroll. A silent child with her face hidden in her father's coat. This was what had come to Silver Crown on the worst week of Vivian Harroway's adult life. She had 800 cattle, or she'd had them, before 50 disappeared 4 days ago. She had 12 remaining workers, half of whom could be gone by morning if anyone made them a better offer. She had a foreman who'd stolen her operation out from under her and documented friends in every corner of the valley. She needed 50 trained ranch hands, 3 experienced cattle managers, a legal team, and possibly a small army. She had 1 cowboy and a child who wouldn't look at her. "I can offer you 30 days, Vivian said. "Room for you and the girl in the west bunkhouse. It's separate from the main crew quarters, which is mostly empty anyway. Meals included. Pay at the end of the month if you last that long." Cade nodded. "That's fair. I should tell you what you're walking into." "I've already heard some of it." "Not all of it," he met her eyes. "Then tell me the rest in the morning. Tonight we just need dry and warm." She stepped back and let them in. Tilly Hollister crossed the threshold without looking up, found a spot near the fireplace, and sat down on the floor with her knees drawn up, her wet hair over her face. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't move from that spot for the better part of an hour. Vivian brought them both dry towels, coffee for Cade, and a cup of warmed milk for Tilly that she set on the floor near the girl without comment. She went back to the desk and kept working. About 40 minutes later, she heard, very quietly, the sound of Tilly drinking her milk. It was, she thought, the smallest possible thing. It should not have made her feel better. It did anyway. Morning came gray and wet, the storm exhausted but not entirely finished with them. Vivian had the full accounting ready by the time Cade appeared at the kitchen doorway, and she laid it out the way she would have laid it out for a business partner clearly, without softening it. 31 crew gone, 12 remaining, half unreliable. 50 head taken from the north pasture 4 days ago, no recovery. Suppliers cut off. Fraudulent legal documents claiming Bram Kessler held operational authority. Neighboring ranchers using Silver Crown water without permission. And this morning, she'd discovered it late last night. 3 additional fence cuts along the eastern boundary. Cade listened to all of it without interrupting. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, elbows on his knees, and he listened the way people listen when they are actually processing, rather than just waiting to respond. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much of this do you actually understand?" he asked. Cattle side, not the money side. Vivian didn't take offense. It was a real question. "Less than I need to." "Okay," he set down the coffee. "Then here's what I want to do first. I want to walk every section of fence on the eastern boundary and tell you exactly what kind of cut that is, because fence cuts aren't all the same, and somebody who knows what they're doing can read them like a letter. Then I want to look at the water gates on the north pasture. Then I want to see your branding records. That's 3 things. It's a starting list." She studied him. "Why the branding records?" "Because if somebody moved 50 head off your land in 4 days, without anyone seeing them go, and you said no one saw them go, they needed a reason to explain why those cattle aren't wearing your brand anymore. He looked at her steadily. I want to know if the records match what's actually in your remaining herd. The silence stretched a moment. You think he's been altering brands, she said. I don't know yet. I want to look. He stood up. You coming? Put on her coat and came. The fence on the eastern boundary had been cut in 3 places, all of them clean too clean, Cade said, crouching beside the wire and running his thumb along the edge. Not broken by cattle pushing through, not rusted or wind damaged. A good wire cutter, used deliberately, by someone who understood that a clean cut looked less suspicious than a broken fence, but still accomplished the same thing. The cattle didn't come through here, Cade said, standing up and scanning the terrain. How do you know? No churn in the mud, even with the rain. 50 head moving through a cut fence leave marks for 2 days. Whatever weather comes. He walked along the fence line slowly, and she walked beside him. These cuts were made after the cattle were already gone. Somebody came back and cut the fence to make it look like the cattle escaped. Vivian stopped walking. Why would Bram bother? If he already took them. Because an escape is an accident. A theft is a crime. He looked at her. He's trying to give himself an explanation for every step. He's planned this for a while. Yes, ma'am, he has. They walked back through the pasture without talking much. The remaining cattle moved away from them, nervous, not used to strangers on foot. Vivian noticed she was reading their behavior differently than she would have yesterday, watching which direction they moved, whether they bunched or spread, whether the grass was worn to dirt in patterns that made sense for the number of animals. She wasn't sure when she'd started doing that, sometime in the last hour. The Watergate, she said. Cade nodded, and they changed direction. Amos was waiting for them at the main barn when they got back, visibly agitated, his one good eye sharp and unhappy. Miss Harroway. Man from the Cattlemen's Association left a message this morning. What kind of message? The kind that comes with a deadline. Amos handed her a folded paper. Association meeting in 4 days. They're voting on whether to temporarily suspend Silver Crown's grazing rights on the shared range pending resolution of the. He squinted at the paper management dispute. They can't do that, Vivian said. Our grazing rights are 60 years old. They can do a temporary suspension while something's under dispute. Association rules. He looked miserable about delivering this. I'm sorry, Miss Harroway. Vivian folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She looked at Cade. He shook his head slightly. Not now. Not in front of Amos. Thank you, Amos, she said. Let me know if anything else comes in. She waited until the old man shuffled back toward the office before she turned to Cade. He's using the association, she said. He's calling in every favor at once. He's moving fast, because he didn't expect you to still be standing. Cade said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment, just as an assessment. Bram thought firing him would break you, that you'd sign his papers or hire lawyers who'd take 6 months to do anything useful. He didn't plan for you to still be here 4 days later actually counting cattle. I'm not going to sign his papers, I know. He paused. The water gates have been adjusted, not broken adjusted. Someone who knew the system changed the flow rates to favor the north pasture sections that border Delaney land. Which means Delaney's been getting Silver Crown water for, I'm guessing, at least 3 months. He's been doing this since before my father died, Vivian said. Not a question. Yes, she stood there and let that land properly. While her father was dying in that room upstairs, while she was sitting beside him, holding his hand and making herself believe the numbers in the ledger meant the ranch was fine. Bram Kessler had been taking it apart piece by piece. All right, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. Show me how the Watergate works. Cade looked at her for just a moment. Something in his expression shifted, barely perceptible, not quite surprise, but close to it. Yes, ma'am, he said. Tilly appeared that afternoon. Not dramatically, she didn't announce herself, didn't ask permission, simply materialized at the edge of the horse corral, where Vivian was learning how to read the gate mechanism Cade had opened. One moment the corral was empty, except for Vivian and Cade and Pete. The next moment Tilly was sitting on the top fence rail, legs hanging, watching. Vivian glanced at Cade. He shrugged minimally. This was apparently normal. She'll follow you around for a while, he said quietly. Don't talk directly at her. Just let her be where she is. Is she all right? She's fine. She does this. Tilly watched the Watergate demonstration without blinking. She had brown eyes that moved constantly, not nervous constantly, more like recording constantly, like she was making a continuous catalog of everything she saw and filing it somewhere deep for future use. When Cade explained the adjustment mechanism to Vivian, how the flow rate had been changed, how long it would take to reset the system properly, how you could tell the difference between normal wear and deliberate alteration, Tilly listened too. She didn't ask questions. She didn't comment. But twice, while Cade was explaining something, her gaze shifted to a specific part of the mechanism before he pointed to it, like she was slightly ahead of the lesson. Does she understand what we're talking about? Vivian asked Cade later quietly, while Tilly was walking the fence line alone. More than you'd think, he said. What happened to her mother? He was quiet long enough that she almost took the question back. Fever, he said finally. 18 months ago. Quick. He watched his daughter walk along the fence. Tilly was with her. I wasn't. Vivian didn't say she was sorry. It seemed like a word he'd heard enough times that it had stopped meaning anything. Nodded and looked back at her notes. 3 days after Cade's arrival, Pete came back from the north section, with his face the color of old flour. Miss Harroway, you'd better come. The north barn was burning. Not a small fire, a full, committed fire. Someone had used accelerant on the east wall, and the whole structure was 20 feet of flame when Vivian got there. They saved nothing inside. The water they carried made no difference. All they could do was keep it from spreading to the adjacent fence structures and wait for it to eat itself out. Vivian stood at the edge of the firelight and watched 3 years of stored equipment turn to ash. Cade stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while because there wasn't much to say. That's his answer, she said finally. To what? To the fact that we haven't broken yet. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were dry, which cost her something, and she knew it showed. Getting impatient. Good. Impatient men make mistakes. He's burned my barn, Cade. I know. What's the mistake worth in a barn? He turned and looked at her directly. The mistake is that he's scared. He wasn't scared last week. He is now. Morning brought Bram Kessler himself. He rode in at 9 o'clock with 2 association officials. She recognized Carver Walsh, who ran the largest competing operation in the valley, and a man named Dunmore, who handled association compliance. They came in a clean buckboard while Silver Crown still smelled of smoke, and the north barn was a skeleton of black timber against the gray sky. Bram looked at the ruin. He looked at Vivian. He had the particular expression of a man performing regret. Terrible thing, he said. Fire. It is, Vivian agreed. Miss Harroway. Dunmore stepped forward, paper in hand. As a result of the ongoing management situation, and in light of recent incidents at Silver Crown, the association has authorized us to offer a supervised transition of operations. Temporary, of course, until the courts can know, Vivian said. Dunmore blinked. I'm sorry? No. I won't accept supervised transition, temporary or otherwise. Silver Crown is not in dispute. It is mine. The court documents you're describing as a management claim are fraudulent, and I will be demonstrating that in the appropriate venue. Bram smiled at her with his whole face, like a man watching a child play chess. Vivian, be reasonable. You've lost your crew, your minutes. Cut my fences, Bram. The smile stayed in place. His eyes didn't quite match it. That's a serious accusation. I know. I'm also aware that you adjusted my water gates to benefit Delaney land without my permission, that the 50 head missing from my north pasture were moved deliberately and not through any fence gap, and that the fire last night was set, not accidental. The smile faded by about half. Those are very serious accusations, Dunmore said carefully. They are. I'll be making them formally, with evidence. She looked directly at Bram. You have 72 hours on your own deadline, don't you? I believe you mentioned that to several people in town. Something crossed Bram's face, not quite surprise. Something harder. Think carefully, he said quietly. I am thinking carefully. That's the problem you're having. She looked at the 2 association officials. Gentlemen, you're welcome to Silver Crown's hospitality for as long as you'd like. But the answer is no. They left. She went back inside and sat down at the desk, and this time her hands were not shaking. From the doorway, she heard a sound so small she almost missed it. She turned. Tilly Hollister was standing in the hallway just outside the office, looking directly at Vivian for the very first time. In her hands, she held a small leather-bound book, one of the old tackroom ledgers, the kind her father had kept records in before the main ledgers took over. Tilly held it out toward Vivian. Vivian crossed the room and took it. She opened it. The handwriting was her father's, old entries going back several years. But in the margins penciled in, cramped and careful, were notations she'd never seen before. Numbers that didn't match the main ledger. Cattle counts that were lower than reported. Brand alterations noted in her father's precise engineer's shorthand. Edmund Harroway had known. He had been watching and documenting, and he had hidden this book somewhere. Only someone who knew every corner of his tack room would ever find it. Vivian looked up at Tilly. "Where did you find this?" she asked very quietly. Tilly pointed at the ceiling up and east, somewhere in the tack room above the stable. "Thank you," Vivian said. Tilly looked at the floor, but before she did, Vivian caught the edge of something on the girl's face, the smallest possible beginning of an expression that might, if given time, become a smile. Vivian held the ledger in both hands and thought about her father, dying in his bed upstairs, watching Bram dismantle everything he'd spent a lifetime building, unable to stop it, but doing the only thing he still could, writing it down. Hiding it, waiting for someone to look. She had been looking in the wrong places. His daughter had been looking at silk dresses and railroad portfolios. His ranch had been watched over, in the end, by a silent 9-year-old girl who noticed things. Outside, Cade was in the yard repairing a fence panel that had been damaged in the night. She could see him through the window, working steadily, no wasted motion, hat pulled against the morning light. Pete was helping him. Even old Shep had come out to hold boards. 12 people, 1 ledger, 72 hours. Vivian Harroway opened to the first page of her father's hidden record, picked up a pen, and started reading. Vivian read her father's hidden ledger until the lamp burned low and her eyes started pulling the words apart into shapes instead of meaning. Then she read it again. Edmund Harroway had not been a man who wrote in margins. His main ledgers were precise, formal, the kind of record-keeping that reflected a man who believed clarity was a form of respect for the work, for the people who depended on it, for whoever came after him. But in this small tack room book, hidden behind a loose board in the shelf above the saddle rack, he had written like a man running out of time and knowing it. Cramped, fast, dates and numbers without explanation because he was writing for himself, not for a reader. Except that at the end, at the very last entry, dated 11 days before he died, he had written one sentence in full. "She will find it when she is ready to look." Vivian sat with that sentence for a while. She wasn't sure if it made her feel better or worse. She decided it didn't matter which. What mattered was what the numbers said. She had Amos in the office by 6 in the morning, before the rest of the yard was moving, and she set the hidden ledger beside the main accounting books and told him to start cross-referencing. Amos took one look at her father's margin notations, took one look at Vivian's face, and simply said, "All right," and began. Cade was in the yard before 6:30, which she had already started to understand was just what he did. He didn't sleep late. He didn't ease into mornings. He appeared, assessed what needed doing, and began doing it, and if you wanted to talk to him, you went outside and talked while he worked, because he wasn't going to stop working, just because conversation was happening. She went outside. "My father knew," she said. Cade was checking the repaired fence panel from the previous day, running his hand along the wire to feel for weak points. He didn't look up. How much did he know? Enough. Brand alterations. Cattle counts that don't match what Bram reported to the association. A note about a holding area near Crow's Spine Ridge that shouldn't exist. She paused. He was sick for 8 months before he died. He couldn't write out himself. He could only write down what people told him and what the numbers said. And nobody he trusted enough to hand the book to. Nobody except, she stopped. Cade did look up then. "He left it where Tilly found it," Vivian said. "In the tack room. Behind a loose board that a grown man would never notice unless he already knew it was there. A child at eye level with the shelf would see the gap." Cade straightened. Something moved across his face that wasn't easy to read. Pride, maybe, or something older and sadder underneath the pride. She goes into tack rooms, he said. Everywhere we've been. She likes the smell. Leather and oil and horses. Since her mother, he stopped. She goes into tack rooms and sits. She was sitting in yours when she found it? I don't know. I didn't ask her yet. Vivian looked toward the west bunkhouse, where a thin line of smoke from the small stove meant Tilly was awake. I need to show you what the ledger says about Crow's Spine Ridge. He left the fence. They went inside. The 60-day window her father's entries described was worse than Vivian had calculated on her own. Bram hadn't started stealing cattle last month or even last season. He'd started carefully, slowly, in quantities small enough to disappear inside normal loss figures nearly 2 years ago. 20 head here, 30 there. Always moved during drives when the count was hardest to verify, always routed through arrangements that looked like legitimate sales until you pulled the actual bills of sale and compared them against what the association recorded. Her father had noticed the discrepancy in the association records. He'd started comparing them against his own private counts, which he'd been doing himself alone, from a wagon, because he was too sick to ride. He'd found the gap. He just hadn't lived long enough to close it. Crow's Spine Ridge, Cade said, running his finger along the map Amos had unrolled on the desk. The old bookkeeper hovered at the edge of the lamplight, looking like a man who had swallowed something bad and was waiting to see what happened next. That's on the far north boundary. What's behind the ridge? Nobody uses it, Amos said. There's an old trail, but it hasn't been a regular route in 30 years. The terrain's rough on the east side of the mountain, and the grazing isn't good enough to justify pushing cattle up that far. Unless you're not grazing them, Cade said. Unless you're holding them. How long can you hold 400 head in rough terrain before they start losing condition? Vivian asked. Depends on water and grass. If there's a valley on the other side. He looked at the map. Is there? Amos traced a line with his finger. There's a box valley. 1/4 mile wide, maybe 1/2 mile long. Creek runs through it. Fed by snowmelt, runs year-round. Then you could hold them there for months, Cade said, if you had hands rotating through to manage them. And if you were processing them out in small batches altering brands, moving them south through cooperating ranches, you could keep the whole thing invisible indefinitely. Until someone counted the gap between what was sold and what was bought, Vivian said. Father counted it, and then he died. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, Pete was moving horses between paddocks, the sound of hooves on packed dirt the only thing coming through the walls. We need to go up there, Vivian said. Not yet, Cade said immediately. Kate, not yet. He wasn't arguing with her, he was just certain. If we ride up to Crow's Spine and we're right, Bram knows within hours that we've found it. He has enough people watching this ranch that he'll know the moment we head north, with any kind of purpose. We've got maybe one chance to catch him with those cattle still in that valley. If he moves them before we get there with witnesses, he spread his hands. We've got a ledger with your dead father's handwriting and no cattle. Vivian pressed her lips together. He was right. She hated that he was right. Then what do we do for the next? We work the ranch, he said. Visibly. Normally. We fix fences. We move the remaining cattle to good grass. We do everything a struggling operation does to keep itself running. And we keep counting brands. Why brands specifically? Because if he's been altering Silver Crown brands before moving cattle out, there should be a pattern. Tool he uses? The placement, the age of the scarring relative to the original brand. If I can establish what the alteration looks like, I can identify your cattle even after they've been moved. He looked at her. And that makes the evidence stick when we find them. Vivian nodded slowly. How long do we have before the association meeting? 4 days, Amos said. 3 now, she corrected. Morning. 3 days, Cade said. That's enough time if we work fast and don't waste any of it. Picked up his hat. Vivian picked up her coat. They went back outside and got to work. The next 36 hours were the hardest physical stretch of Vivian Harroway's life, and she was privately appalled to discover how much she had underestimated that fact. She knew she wasn't soft. She'd grown up around a working ranch, even if she'd spent years in the East, getting an education her father thought she needed. Could ride. She knew the general shape of what cattle management involved. She had walked fence lines before, ridden pastures before, spent mornings in the saddle before. None of that had prepared her for what Cade set as a working pace. They were up before light. They checked the remaining herd, 263 head, once she'd done a proper count, which was nearly 600 fewer than the ledger claimed Silver Crown held at the start of the year, and moved the animals to the sections with the best remaining grass. They repaired 3 fence sections on the south boundary. They reset the water gate on the north pasture to its correct flow position, which took most of the morning because the adjustment mechanisms had been deliberately stiffened with packed grit, and Cade had to work it clean by hand. In the afternoon, they checked brands. This was Cade's work specifically, and he was methodical about it in a way that made Vivian understand she was watching someone do something they genuinely knew. He moved through the herd animal by animal, not rushing, not rough, reading each Silver Crown brand the way she read account books. Angle of the iron, depth of the scar, age. Twice he stopped and called her over. "Look at this one," he said. She looked. The brand looked fine to her. "Now look here." He pointed to a spot 2 inches below the brand, hidden in the coarser belly hair. "See the edge of that? Not healed the same as the brand. Different age." She looked harder. He was right, there was a faint secondary mark, a line that curved in a way the Silver Crown brand didn't. "That's not a natural scar," she said. "No, that's where someone tried a partial alteration and stopped. Either the animal moved, or they decided it wasn't worth finishing on this one." He straightened and looked across the herd. "Which means at least some of your remaining cattle have already been tagged for moving. He's still doing it, while we've been here. He doesn't know what we know yet. He thinks we're just trying to keep the operation running long enough to the legal claim." Cade's jaw tightened slightly. "But he's still processing cattle out, probably through Delaney's South Range. Small batches, regular intervals." Vivian looked at the half-altered brand. Her father's mark, her grandfather's mark, the thing that proved these animals were Silver Crowns regardless of what any fraudulent bill of sale claimed. And underneath it, barely visible, someone's attempt to erase it. "Can you tell what the secondary mark is? What brand he's using?" "Not from a partial. I need to find a complete alteration." He looked at the herd. "And I think Tilly might be more help with that than either of us." Vivian looked at him. "She sees things," he said simply. "Small things. I don't fully understand how she decides what to look at, but she doesn't miss much." Tilly had been following them at a distance all afternoon. Not underfoot, not intrusive, just present, about 30 yards back, moving when they moved, stopping when they stopped, her eyes making that constant quiet catalog of everything in front of her. Cade crouched down when she came closer. "Tilly bird. You see the marks on the cattle?" She nodded. "The regular marks, those are Silver Crown's brand. The other ones, the ones underneath or beside. Can you show me one that's got both?" Tilly looked at the herd for about 10 seconds. Then she walked directly to a 3-year-old heifer near the water trough, crouched beside it, and pointed. Cade moved in behind her and looked. He was still for a moment. "That's a complete alteration," he said quietly. He looked up at Vivian. "Come see this." The original Silver Crown brand was still faintly visible beneath a newer mark, a crude shape like an inverted V with a short bar. Applied over the original, not next to it, using a running iron to fill in and redirect the lines. "I've seen this brand before," Cade said. "Whose is it?" He stood up, and his face had an expression that was not quite anger, more like the particular cold clarity that settles in when something you suspected turns out to be true. "It's not a registered brand. It's a working mark. Kind you use when you're moving cattle through, and you don't want the paperwork to follow them." He paused. The Connor operation used a similar one for moving unregistered horses up north. Legitimate operations don't use marks like this. So these cattle aren't being sold under Silver Crown's name or under a legitimate buyer's name. "They're being laundered," he said, "moved through intermediaries who don't ask questions. The money comes back clean, and there's no paper trail that connects to Bram Kessler." He looked at the heifer. "This animal has probably been promised to someone already. The mark means she's claimed. How many in our herd?" "I don't know yet." "Tilly," he turned to his daughter. "Can you walk the whole herd? Look for the same mark. Don't touch the animals. Just look." Tilly walked the herd. She was in there for 40 minutes, moving quietly among the cattle in a way that didn't disturb them, her slight 9-year-old frame threading between animals 3 times her size without hesitation. She had no fear of them. She moved like she belonged there. When she came back, she held up 7 fingers. 7 head, Cade said. Out of 260. That's 3% of what's left, Vivian said. If he's taken nearly 600 already, then the remaining herd isn't his primary target anymore. He's already taken most of what he's going to take. Cade looked north, toward the distant ridge. What's in that valley is what he's been accumulating. Hundreds of head, waiting to be moved in one final batch before he closes the operation. He's almost finished, Vivian said. He doesn't need to bleed us slowly anymore. He's about to cut and run, which is why he's pushing hard on the legal claim and the association vote. He needs legitimate cover for leaving. He wants it to look like he won through proper channels, not like he disappeared with your cattle. Vivian felt the timeline compress in her chest, all of it pressing inward. 3 days, she said. Less now, Cade said. That night, Bram made his next move, and it came from a direction Vivian hadn't fully prepared for. A rider came to the gate at 9 in the evening, not aggressive, not armed visibly, just a man on a horse with a lamp, and asked to speak with Pete. Vivian watched from the porch. Pete went to the gate and talked to the man for 4 minutes. She could see Pete's body language from 30 yards. First, neutral, then uncertain, then the particular rigidity of someone being offered something they want and trying to decide whether they're allowed to want it. The rider left. Pete stood at the gate for a moment, then walked back toward the barn without looking toward the house. Vivian went to find him. He was in the barn pretending to check a horse's near foreleg. He was 19 years old and not a natural liar. Pete. Miss Harroway. What did he offer you? Pete straightened. He had an honest face, which in this situation meant it was doing him no favors. Job, he said. Kessler's new operation. Starting wage better than what I'm making here. He paused. He said he'd be running 3 ranches by the end of the year. 3 ranches, she said. Where do you suppose he's getting the money for 3 ranches? Pete was quiet. You can go, she said. I won't hold you. Nobody here is being held. I don't want to go, Pete said, and it came out slightly more forceful than he intended. He looked embarrassed by it. You should know he's offering. To everyone, probably. Not just me. He's trying to take the last 12. Yes, ma'am. She nodded. Thank you for telling me. She went back inside and told Cade. He took it the way he took most things without visible agitation, just factoring it in. How many do you think he'll get? I don't know, 3, maybe 4. She sat down. If I lose more than half of what I have left, we can't stop him from making offers. All we can do is move faster. He was quiet a moment. There's another thing. Tell me, if he's 3 days from the association meeting, and he knows we haven't broken yet, he's going to look for something definitive. He chose the next word carefully. Something that makes you look incapable rather than unlucky. What kind of something? Could be the cattle. Could be the legal claim moving faster than expected. Could be something we haven't thought of. He looked at her steadily. Is there anything else in your operation that's vulnerable? She thought. The railroad investments. But those are held separately, legally distinct from ranch operations. He couldn't touch those without... She stopped. What? Cade asked. Supply contracts. For the fall drive. She was already moving toward the desk. Silver Crown holds a supply contract with the Cheyenne stockyards. Annual cattle delivery, fixed price, signed 6 months ago. That contract is voided or transferred. Can he transfer it without your signature? No. But he could argue if he had those fraudulent management documents notarized and registered. She was pulling papers from the lower desk drawer. If someone at the county recorder's office accept his claim as preliminary and put a hold on Silver Crown's business transactions. She found what she was looking for. Read it. Read it again. He already filed it, she said. 10 days ago. Before my father was even buried 3 weeks. She set the paper down. County recorder put a provisional notice on Silver Crown's contract authority pending dispute resolution. Cade said nothing. My fall delivery contract is frozen, she said. The stockyards in Cheyenne are expecting 800 head from Silver Crown in 6 weeks. I have 260. The contract is frozen, so I can't renegotiate the terms, and if I miss the delivery, the stockyards pull the contract and your revenue for the year is gone, Cade finished. And Bram has managed to steal my cattle, freeze my contracts, and make it look like I did it to myself through poor management. She sat down, very deliberately, the controlled sit of someone who was not going to tip into whatever was on the other side of losing control. Planned this before my father died, every piece of it. Cade was looking at something past her shoulder, a middle-distance thing, the focused nowhere look of a man running calculations. The ledger, he said. What about it? Your father's hidden ledger. If it documents the brand alterations and the cattle counts going back 2 years, does it go back far enough to predate Bram's fraudulent management claim? She opened it, checked the first date. Yes, by 14 months. Then it establishes that Bram's claim is fraudulent before it was even filed. Court can't uphold a management transfer that was submitted in bad faith by someone actively stealing the operation's assets. He met her eyes. But we need the cattle, Vivian. The ledger proves fraud. Cattle prove the scale. One without the other gets you a legal fight that lasts 2 years. Both together. Ends it, she said. Yes. She looked at the ledger. The stockyard notice. At the map on the wall with the penciled mark near Crow's Spine Ridge. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he agreed. She didn't sleep that night. Not fully. She went in and out of something that wasn't quite rest, lying in her father's bed in her father's room, because her own room still felt like a guest's room, and she needed the weight of familiar things around her. At some point past midnight, she heard, very faintly, the creak of the porch outside. She got up and looked through the window. Cade was sitting on the porch steps in the dark. Just sitting, his elbows on his knees, looking out at the yard where the moon was painting everything in the blue-gray version of itself. He had a coffee cup, but he wasn't drinking from it. She almost went out. She didn't. Some moments aren't yours to interrupt. She recognized that about him, without understanding exactly why she recognized it, something in the particular quality of the solitude. The way it wasn't loneliness exactly, but something that had decided to live alongside a person instead of inside them. She went back to bed and slept properly for about 3 hours, which was enough. By morning, 2 more things had happened. First, Pete was still there. So was Shep. 2 of the laborers from the stock pen had left in the night, and Vivian found their absence at breakfast, 2 empty places at the long table that Dottie served anyway out of habit. Nobody mentioned the empty places. They ate and went to work. Second, Tilly had gone out before anyone else was up. Cade noticed at breakfast and went out to find her. He came back in 10 minutes. She's in the north pasture, he said. Walking fence line. Alone? She does this, she's fine. He poured coffee. She's been doing it every morning since we arrived. She's looking for something, Vivian said. Probably. He sat down. She'll tell me when she finds it, or she'll show me. It takes her time to decide what's worth saying. They were still at breakfast when Tilly came through the kitchen door. She didn't sit. She went directly to her father, took his hand and pulled. All right, he said, and put his coffee down. Tilly looked at Vivian. Unambiguous. You too, Cade translated. They followed her across the north pasture, through the boundary fence at the low crossing point, and up a rocky slope that climbed toward the tree line. Tilly moved like she'd walked this route already, probably multiple times, her feet finding the sure places in the loose shale without hesitation. They walked for about 20 minutes before she stopped. Pointed. It took Vivian a moment to see it. A trail old, barely a trail really, more of a remembered path through the grass and rocks heading north and east toward the far ridge. But on the path fresh, recent enough that the rain hadn't washed them. Tracks. A lot of them. Cattle tracks. How recent? Vivian asked. Cade crouched and looked. 2 days, maybe 3. He stood. They came through here at night. The edges are cleaner than they'd be. If animals were moving at speed, they were walking them. Controlled. Quiet. Coming through or going out. He read the direction of the tracks. Going out. Moving north. They're still taking them. Vivian turned and looked back at Silver Crown behind them, at the ranch visible in pieces between the trees. While we've been counting brands and reading ledgers, he's been moving cattle through our own north boundary. He's using your land as the route, Cade said. If anyone tracks the cattle, it starts on Silver Crown property. It points back to you. She stood on that hillside and let the full architecture of it settle into her. How thoroughly it had been designed, how many separate directions it attacked from simultaneously. The legal claim, the crew, the suppliers, the water, the brands, the contracts, the route. Each piece looked like a different problem. They were all one problem. Bram Kessler hadn't stolen her ranch. He'd built a machine designed to make her hand it over willingly, because fighting a machine from the inside was nearly impossible. Nearly. We're going to the ridge, she said. Cade looked at her. Tonight, she said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I need to know how many cattle are in that valley before the association meeting, and I need someone else to know it with me. I'm not taking Tilly up. She stays here with Amos and Pete. Just us. She held his eyes, and we bring Shep. He's old, but he knows every cattle brand in this territory. If he can confirm the Silver Crown originals under the alterations, his word means something. Cade was quiet, working through it. If we're right about what's up there, he said finally, and we go up there tonight, Bram is going to know by morning. Yes, she said, and he'll move. Then we have to be ready for what happens when he moves, she said. We need witnesses. Who in this valley doesn't owe Bram a favor? Cade thought. The Halter brothers. Small operation on the west side. They've been cut out of the water agreements, same as you. Bram never needed them. He paused. Possibly the widow Crane. She runs 50 head on her own, and she doesn't go to association meetings because she's never been made to feel welcome. 3 of us going up the ridge tonight, and 3 people we trust who'll be ready to ride at dawn when we come back with what we know. She looked down at her father's hidden ledger, which she'd carried out of habit. My father spent 8 months alone with what he knew. I'm not doing this alone. No, Cade said, you're not. They went back down the hill. Tilly walked between them, which she hadn't done before. Usually she trailed behind and she didn't take either of their hands. But she was there, right between them, and somehow that was its own kind of statement. At the bottom of the slope, before they reached the fence, Cade stopped. Vivian. She turned. You should know. He stopped. Started again. I've worked for a lot of people. Some of them were good people who were bad at the job. Some of them were good at the job and bad people. In 12 years, I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen someone learn what you've learned in 4 days. She looked at him. Is that a compliment or a warning? Both, he said. People who learn fast tend to also move fast. And sometimes moving fast is right. But tonight, I know, she said. Tonight we move carefully. He nodded. They went back through the fence and across the pasture toward the ranch, and the morning light hit Silver Crown's remaining herd, where they grazed in the south section, copper and brown against the grass, and Vivian counted them automatically now. The way she was beginning to count everything a reflex she hadn't had a week ago and couldn't imagine not having now. 258 head visible, 2 missing from the last count. She noted it and kept walking. There was work to do, and after the work there was a ridge to climb. And after the ridge there was a reckoning that had been a long time coming for everyone in Red Willow Valley who had decided a woman with a silk dress and a grief-dazed face wasn't worth taking seriously. Vivian Harroway pulled her coat against the morning wind and went to find Shep. Shep didn't ask many questions when Vivian told him what they needed. He listened, looked at the map, looked at the trail marks Cade described, and said, I knew something was wrong with the North Count last spring. Told Bram the numbers were off. He told me I was getting old. He picked up his hat. Turns out I was right and he was stealing. I'd like to go see those cattle. They left at 9 that night. 3 of them Vivian, Cade, Shep on horseback, no lamps. Moving along the tree line where the darkness was thickest and the ground softest under the horses' feet. Tilly was back at the ranch with Amos and Pete, which Cade had made clear to her was not optional. She had not argued. She had simply looked at her father with those recording eyes of hers, and then gone inside, which meant she understood and was filing it away, and Cade trusted that more than protests would have reassured him. The night was cold the way. Wyoming nights are cold, even heading into summer not brutal, but honest about itself, reminding you that the mountains didn't particularly care about the season on the calendar. Vivian had borrowed one of her father's old riding coats from the tack room because her own coats were the wrong kind of warm. The one she'd chosen still smelled faintly of Edmund Harroway pipe tobacco and saddle oil, and something she couldn't name that was just him, and she had stood in the tack room for about 30 seconds being ambushed by it, before she put the coat on anyway and went outside. They followed Tilly's trail from that morning. Cade had memorized the landmarks in daylight: a split-trunk pine at the first slope, a flat shale formation at the second turn, a dry creek bed that ran east for about a quarter-mile before the terrain changed. He moved them through all of it without hesitation and without lights, which Vivian found both impressive and slightly unnerving, because she could barely see the split-trunk pine, even when he pointed directly at it. "How do you do that?" she asked, quiet, keeping her voice low the way Cade had told her to before they left. "Do what?" "Navigate in the dark. You stop looking and start reading," he said. "Ground slope, wind direction, sound of water. Your horse knows more than you do at night. Let her feet make the decisions." Tried it. Her horse, a reliable gray mare named Callum's Girl, a name her father had given the animal for reasons nobody had ever satisfactorily explained, did seem to be navigating with more confidence than Vivian felt. She loosened her grip on the reins slightly and noticed the mare's path correct itself by about 2 degrees, finding better footing on the shale. "Better," Cade said, though she hadn't said anything. Shep rode behind them in silence. He was one of those old cowboys who had made a kind of peace with discomfort, cold nights, long rides, bad news that showed as stillness rather than resignation. He just was where he was, and he'd deal with what came. They climbed for an hour and a half. The trail grew rougher past the tree line, the shale more broken, the horses picking their way carefully through terrain that wanted to roll an ankle. Vivian's thighs were burning from the sustained uphill work, and she was not going to mention it. At the ridge crest, the wind hit them properly, not vicious, but purposeful, the kind that reminded you how exposed you were, and then they came over the top and looked down. The valley was black from above. Then her eyes adjusted and she started seeing shapes. Movement, the slow, restless shifting of animals in a confined space at night. Dark masses against darker ground, hundreds of them, and the faint smell came up on the wind: livestock, grass, animal warmth unmistakable once you knew what you were smelling. "There," Cade said softly. Shep made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a word. Just the specific noise a man makes when something he suspected turns out to be much larger than he prepared for. They watched for a while from the ridge without going down. Vivian counted what she could make out impossible to be precise in the dark, but the valley floor was covered with cattle from the north fence to the south, with a narrow creek running through the middle, reflecting the starlight back up in a thin silver line. "How many do you think?" she asked. 400 minimum, Cade said. "Could be close to 5. Hard to tell in this light. With the 50 taken from the north pasture and what the ledger accounts for over 2 years. That's most of what's gone," he said. "They're in good condition," Shep said quietly, from behind them. "Even from here, I can see they've got weight on them. Whoever's been managing this valley knows what they're doing. They've been here a while. Long enough to alter brands and process them out in batches," Cade said. "Long enough to look like a legitimate operation, if you didn't know better," Shep said. Vivian looked at the valley below her. Silver Crown cattle, her grandfather's cattle, the animals her father had spent a lifetime breeding for quality penned in a hidden valley, while Bram Kessler stood in association meetings talking about her incompetence. "I want to go down," she said. "Vivian, not far. I want Shep to see the brands up close. I need him to be able to say with certainty what he saw and how close he was." She looked at Cade. "You said one without the other isn't enough. The ledger and the cattle together. I need Shep's eyes on those brands." Cade was quiet for a moment. "We go in quiet, no lamps until we're at the fence line, and can see whether anyone's watching the herd." He looked at Shep. "You all right with that? I'm 63 years old, and I've been sleeping in that bunkhouse, watching a good ranch get stolen for 6 months, Shep said. "I'm better than all right." They went down. There was a watcher. One man sitting at the north end of the valley near a small fire that he'd built low and partially shielded, professional enough to reduce the visibility, not professional enough to understand that even a shielded fire created a silhouette. and that silhouette was visible from the ridge for anyone who knew to look for it. Cade saw it first. He put his hand back toward Vivian without turning, the flat palm stop signal, and they held their horses still on the slope while he watched the fire for 3 minutes. "One man," he said finally. "He's not walking a perimeter. He's sitting. Paid to be present, not to be careful," Shep said. "Right." Cade scanned the valley edges. "If there's a second one, I can't see him." We go east, away from the fire, down to the fence line. We don't take the horses past the fence. We walk in, we look at the brands on the nearest animals, and we come back out. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Vivian confirmed. They tied the horses in a stand of pine short of the fence. The ground was softer here, the pine needles, swallow needles swallowing the sound of their boots, and they moved along the fence line away from the watcher's fire until the cattle were close enough to touch through the wire. Shep went to work immediately. He was methodical, the way Cade was methodical, unhurried, precise, reading each brand the way a man reads familiar handwriting. He moved along the fence examining 5 animals, then 8, then a dozen. At the 4th animal, he stopped and held up 2 fingers toward Cade, without looking back. Cade leaned in. He looked at what Shep was pointing to, and then he looked at Vivian. Even in the near dark, she could see the shape of it. The Silver Crown brand, her family's mark, the brand she had grown up, seeing on every animal this ranch produced, and over it, the crude alteration mark Tilly had identified in their own remaining herd. The inverted V with the short bar. Clumsy work, done with a running iron, old enough on some animals that the scarring had fully healed. "Silver Crown original underneath," Shep said, barely audible. "On every animal I've checked so far. Bram's mark on top," he looked up. "This is Edmund Harroway's cattle. All of it. I'd stake 30 years of experience on that." "Can you prove it in front of the association?" Vivian asked. "I can prove it in front of anyone who knows cattle." He stood. "That original brand doesn't disappear. Not fully. You can see the line underneath the alteration on every single one of these animals, if you know what you're looking at." "And I know what I'm looking at." Vivian exhaled. Then a branch cracked somewhere to their right. All 3 of them went still. 30 yards away, between 2 pine trees at the valley's eastern edge, a second watcher had apparently not been sitting at a fire. He had been walking the perimeter after all. And he was close enough that when he stopped moving, Vivian could hear him breathing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The watcher stood there for what felt like a full minute, but was probably 15 seconds. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, his boots crunching in the pine needles, moving away. Cade put his mouth close to Vivian's ear. "Now go." They went back to the horses, moving fast but controlled. No running, keeping the sound down. They untied the animals, walked them up the slope away from the valley until the terrain gave them cover, and then rode hard for the ridge. Nobody spoke until they were over the crest and down the other side. They reached Silver Crown before 2 in the morning. Amos was awake, lamp on in the office. Vivian hadn't asked him to wait up, and he hadn't mentioned that he would. He'd simply still been there, and he took one look at their faces when they came in and poured 3 cups of coffee without asking. Vivian sat down. Cade sat across from her. Shep took the 3rd chair and wrapped both hands around his cup and stared at the wall for a while. "He's got close to 500 head in that valley," Vivian said. Amos closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "Saints preserve," he stopped. "Old habit. That's most of what went missing. And Shep can confirm the original brands under the alterations." "I can," Shep said. "So we have the ledger, we have a first-hand identification of the cattle, and we have the trail evidence from the north boundary showing they were moved across Silver Crown land." Vivian looked at Cade. "Is that enough?" "It's enough to take to the association before the vote," Cade said. "But we need more than enough. We need to make it impossible for the association to look the other way." "How?" He set down his cup. "We need the cattle in open country where everyone can see them." Vivian looked at him. "If those animals stay in that valley," he said, "Bram can argue the brands, argue the provenance, tie it up for months. He has lawyers, and he has friends in the association. A dispute about cattle in a hidden valley becomes a he-said situation." He met her eyes. "But if those cattle are standing in Red Willow Valley in daylight, with association officials and neighboring ranchers, and anyone else who can be there watching, while Shep identifies the brands. That's not a dispute anymore. That's evidence. You want to move them, she said. I want to let them move themselves, he said. There's a difference. She understood what he meant. She sat with it for a moment. He'll be there, she said. If we open those gates, Bram will know within an hour. He has armed riders. Probably. And you still think this is the right move. Cade looked at her directly, the way he did when he was about to say something he meant completely. I think Bram Kessler has spent 2 years building a machine that works in the dark and through intermediaries, and with documents that can be disputed. I think if you force that machine into daylight, in front of witnesses, it stops working. He paused. And I think you know that's true, or you wouldn't have gone up that ridge tonight. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, and in that particular light she could see the full texture of the tiredness in his face, a man who had been riding through cold nights and working through hard days and carrying something else underneath all of it, something private that he managed quietly and didn't put down. All right, she said. Tomorrow. We move at first light. First light might not give us enough time to get witnesses there before Bram. Then we get the witnesses there tonight. She stood up. Amos, do you know where the Halter brothers' place is? East Fork Road, about 6 miles. And the Widow Crane? South boundary, just past the old mill crossing. She looked at Cade. You said they might be willing. I said they haven't been bought by Bram. Whether they're willing, he left that incomplete. Then I'll go find out, she said. Vivian, it's 2 a.m. I know what time it is. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up and picked up his hat. Shep, can you ride another 6 miles? I can ride 12 if I have to, Shep said, standing. Then you take the Widow Crane. I'll take the Halter brothers. Vivian, I'll come with you, she said. He didn't argue. The Halter brothers were awake, which turned out to be because one of them, the younger one, a blunt-faced man named Roy, had been up with a colicky horse and had the barn lanterns lit when Vivian and Cade rode in. Roy Halter stood in his barn doorway, with a look that was 1 part suspicion and 2 parts sheer bewilderment at who was calling at this hour. Cade explained it fast and clean. No softening, no circling. The hidden valley, the cattle, the brands, the ledger. The association vote scheduled for the next day. What he was asking. Roy Halter listened with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing particular. When Cade finished, Roy turned and yelled into the barn. Daniel, get out here. Daniel Halter was older by about 4 years and looked it. He came out wiping his hands on a rag and listened to Roy summarize in about 40 seconds what Cade had taken 3 minutes to explain. Then he looked at Vivian. Bram Kessler cut you off the shared water too? He asked. He redirected my water gate to favor Delaney's land, she said. He told us the western line was under repair. Daniel looked at his brother. 3 months of reduced water for repairs that nobody ever did. He was using the capacity for himself, Cade said. Daniel Halter looked at the ground, looked at Vivian. What time do you need us there? Dawn, she said. The North Valley approach, Crow's Spine Ridge. We know it. He turned back to the barn. Roy, get the horses. The Widow Crane was already dressed when Shep arrived, which he reported when he met them back at the Ranch Road intersection at 3:30 in the morning. She had seen his lamp coming up her road and gotten up to meet it. She said she's been waiting for someone to do something about Bram Kessler for 14 months, Shep said. Her words exactly. She's bringing her foreman in 2 hands. That's 7 people, Vivian said. 8 with Pete, Cade said. Pete's coming. When did you ask Pete? Before we left. He said yes before I finished the question. He looked at her. You've got 8 people. 2 of whom can give independent testimony about what they saw in that valley. That's enough. Enough. She was learning the specific weight of that word. Not plenty, not comfortable, not safe. Just enough. Enough to move, enough to try. They slept in shifts for 2 hours. Or Vivian assumed Cade slept. She lay in her father's bed in her riding clothes, staring at the ceiling, and running through every variable she could think of until the sky outside. The window went from black to the dark purple that came before gray. Then she got up, splashed water on her face, and went to find everyone. Tilly was in the yard before any of them. She was standing at the gate in the pre-dawn dark, already in her coat, with an expression that made clear she was not confused about what was happening and was not going to be left behind. Cade stopped when he saw her. She shook her head before he got further. It's not safe. She kept shaking her head. Cade crouched down to her eye level. They had a conversation that Vivian watched from a few feet away, not with words, mostly, but with Tilly's eyes and Cade's face, and a series of small gestures that apparently constituted a language between them, developed over the specific circumstances of the last 18 months. At the end of it, Cade stood up. She stays back from the valley, he said to Vivian. She rides with us to the ridge and stops there. She can see the valley from the top without going in. He looked like he'd lost an argument he'd expected to lose. She won't go further than the ridge. Vivian looked at Tilly. The girl met her eyes. In Tilly Hollister's face was something that was not stubbornness, exactly more like the complete absence of the kind of fear that could be reasoned with, because it wasn't fear. She simply intended to be there. And Vivian, looking at her, thought of her father's note in the hidden ledger. She will find it when she is ready to look. All right, Vivian said. Cade looked at her. She stays on the ridge, Vivian said. And she doesn't come down, regardless of what happens below. Agreed? Tilly nodded once. Good, Vivian said. Then let's go. They met the Halter brothers and 3 of the Widow Crane's people at the base of the north slope as dawn was beginning to happen in the east, not light yet, just the idea of light, the sky making its intentions known. 7 riders, plus Tilly, plus Shep. Vivian counted them once and didn't count again. The Widow Crane herself was a compact, gray-haired woman of about 60, who rode like she'd been born on a horse, which in this territory she probably had been. She nodded at Vivian without preamble. Eleanor Crane, she said. I had 400 head before Bram Kessler convinced the association to revoke my shared grazing rights 2 seasons ago. Now I've got 250. You're telling me those missing animals might be behind that ridge. Some of them might be, Vivian said carefully. Then let's go look. They went up the trail in a line, Cade leading, Vivian behind him, the others strung back through the pines. Tilly rode between Vivian and Shep kept pace beside her without being asked, which Vivian noticed and was grateful for. At the ridge crest, Cade stopped them all. He looked down into the valley. The watcher's fire was out. The cattle were visible in the early light gray-brown shapes, covering the valley floor, the creek catching what light there was. From this angle and in this light, the sheer number of them was clearer than it had been in the dark. Eleanor Crane made a sound beside Vivian. That's 400 head if it's 20, she said quietly. At least, Shep said. Daniel Halter leaned forward in his saddle. I see 2 altered brands from here, and I haven't even gone down yet. How do you see them from this distance? Vivian asked. I know what Bram's running iron does to a scar, Daniel said. I've seen him use it. I thought it was on stray cattle back then. His jaw tightened. I was stupid. You didn't know, Roy said. I should have asked harder questions. He straightened. I'm asking them now. Cade turned his horse to face the group. Here's what I want to do. We go down. We open every gate in that valley. All of them. The cattle pour into open country and they'll run south. There's no fence between here and the Red Willow Road, and they'll follow the creek line down. When they hit the valley floor, the road, the open grazing land, everyone in this county is going to see them. He looked at each person in turn. Bram is going to come. He'll have riders. I need everyone to stay calm and stay together, because this only works if we make it through to the point where we can put those cattle on Silver Crown land and have Shep identify them in front of enough people that it can't be undone. What if his riders draw weapons? Roy Halter asked. Then we don't draw back. We stay between the cattle and the road and we keep them moving. He looked at Roy. This isn't a gunfight. If it becomes one, we lose. This is a public demonstration in front of witnesses. Bram loses the moment. Enough people see those cattle. Roy chewed on that, nodded. Tilly stays on the ridge, Vivian said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. No matter what. Tilly, on her horse at the ridge edge, did not acknowledge this directly. She looked at the valley below with those cataloging eyes, and Vivian had the brief, certain feeling that the girl was memorizing it, the positions, the brands, the layout of the fences the way she memorized everything. Let's go, Cade said. Getting to the valley gates without alerting the remaining watchers took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering through the pine-covered eastern slope. Cade had spotted both watchers from the ridge. There were 3 now, which meant a third had come on during the night, and he routed them around all 3 approach points before they reached the fence line. The valley had 4 gates. Cade assigned pairs to each one. Vivian and Daniel Holter took the main south gate, which was the largest and would release the most cattle at once. Eleanor Crane's foreman took the north, Shep and Roy took the east. Cade took the west himself. On my signal, Cade said, barely above a whisper. Don't open until you hear me. When you hear me, open and get back. Get out of the way of the animals. Split up. Vivian rode to the south gate with Daniel Holter beside her, and she did what she had been doing all week. She stopped thinking about the size of what she was doing and focused on the next specific thing. Gate mechanism. Chain latch, hinge direction. She worked it out in her hands while Daniel covered her back, watching the valley floor for the watchers. Miss Harroway, Daniel said quietly. She looked up. One of the watchers had turned their direction. He was too far to see their faces, but he was looking at the fence line. His body posture changed. Something had caught his attention, some sound or movement or wrong shape in the early light. He started walking toward them. Cade, she said. Not loudly, just directed at the general air, hoping sound carried. It carried. From the far west end of the valley, a gate swung open with a metal clang that the watcher heard from 50 yards, and Cade's voice came across the valley floor, clear and unhurried. Open them. Vivian threw the south gate. The cattle nearest the gate were already shifting. Animals are sensitive to tension, and they'd been picking up the collected human energy for the last 20 minutes, moving restlessly, bunching and pressing. When the gate opened, they came through it in a controlled surge that became a less controlled surge within about 30 seconds as the animals behind the leaders pushed forward. Daniel's horse shied hard, and he stayed on it through sheer leg strength. Vivian's gray mare planted herself sideways and didn't move, which was either excellent training or personal stubbornness, and she didn't care which. The south cattle hit open ground and turned the direction. Cattle always turn when given a choice path downhill, toward water, toward the creek line that ran south toward Red Willow Valley. All 4 gates were open now. The valley was emptying. The watchers were shouting. One of them was on horseback, riding hard in a direction that could only mean one thing: going to find Bram. He's sending for Bram, Vivian said. I know. Cade was beside her suddenly, his horse controlled and calm in a way that required actual work she could see in his hands. How long do you think we have? An hour. Less if Bram's already close. Then we ride with them. Keep the herd moving south and together. Don't let them scatter. If they scatter, we lose the visual, and it becomes impossible for anyone to count brands. Cade. She grabbed his arm as he turned his horse. This goes wrong. If it goes wrong, we still have the ledger and Shep's testimony and the Halter brothers as witnesses. He met her eyes. It's not going to go wrong. He rode into the herd. She followed him. Riding through a moving herd of 400 cattle is nothing like any other experience on Earth, and Vivian had done enough riding in the past week to have opinions about difficult riding, and none of those opinions had prepared her for this. The sounds alone was physical hooves on ground, thousands of them, a sound you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. The smell was overwhelming. The animals moved around her horse in a river that had its own logic and momentum, and Callum's girl navigated it the way Cade had told her to navigate the dark hillside. Stop fighting. Let the feet decide. She rode. She kept her position between the outer animals and the tree line on the east side, pushing strays back into the main body the way she'd watched Cade demonstrate 100 times in the last week. The motion was becoming familiar. Not easy, not comfortable, but her body was learning it in the way bodies learn things that are repeated often enough and urgently enough. Eleanor Crane appeared beside her at a hard canter, her gray hair loose from its pins in the wind. They're going to make the road in 20 minutes, she called over the noise. Is that enough time? It has to be, Eleanor said and rode past her. They were still moving when the sound changed. Vivian heard it before she saw it: hoofbeats from the north, running hard, a different rhythm from the cattle, purposeful and fast. She looked back over her shoulder. Bram Kessler came over the north rise with 8 riders behind him, pulled his horse up at the ridge edge, and looked down at the valley, the empty valley, 4 gates standing open, the last of the cattle streaming south in a mass that was already too spread and too moving to stop. The expression on his face from even this distance was readable. She had expected fury. What she saw was something colder. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the riders moving them. He found Vivian among them. She was sure of it, sure that from 200 yards he picked her out, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he turned to his riders and said something, and they came down the slope. "Cade," she called. He had already seen them. "Keep moving," he said, not to her specifically, to everyone within earshot. "Keep the herd moving. Don't stop. He has 8 riders." "I know. Keep moving." Bram's group came in from the north and east, trying to cut across the herd's direction, trying to turn the lead animals back. 2 of his riders positioned themselves ahead of the cattle and began working to slow the front of the movement. Standard cattle management, the right technique. And if they had enough people and enough time, it would work. They didn't have enough time, because from the south, from the Red Willow Valley Road, came other riders. 3 of them at first, then 5, then more, coming up the creek road as the sound of the herd had carried down the valley, the way sound always carries in open country in the early morning. Neighbors, ranchers, people who had seen or heard the mass of cattle moving south and had come to look, the way you always come to look when hundreds of cattle appear on the road below your property, because cattle on the road are your problem, regardless of whose they are. They weren't witnesses Vivian had called. They were just people who'd heard something happening and come to see what it was. Shep read the moment instantly. He rode directly to the approaching group and started talking before they'd fully stopped their horses. Bram saw it. He rode toward Shep and the gathering witnesses, cutting between cattle, pushing hard. Cade went after Bram. Not aggressively, Cade didn't draw anything, didn't make a threatening move, just rode to intercept at an angle that put him between Bram and the witnesses before Bram got there. "Bram," he said. Bram pulled up, his horse danced under him. His 8 riders were behind him in a loose group, watching. "Get out of my way, Hollister. You can talk to them," Cade said. "I'm not stopping you from talking. I just want to be there when you do." "This is theft," Bram said. "These are cattle under a disputed claim." "These are Silver Crown cattle," Shep said, loudly enough that the gathering crowd could hear him. He had turned his horse to face Bram with the witnesses behind him. "I have 30 years in this valley, and I've been reading brands since before most of you were born. Those animals are wearing altered Silver Crown brands. The original marks are visible underneath the alteration on every single head." He pointed at the nearest cattle moving past. "Any man who wants to look can look." "That's a lie," Bram said. "Then come look with me," Shep said simply. "Come stand next to me and look at the same brand and tell me I'm wrong." Bram did not move toward the cattle. The growing crowd of witnesses was watching him not move. "He's got documents," Daniel Halter said, riding up. "Management claim filed at the county recorder. But Miss Harroway has her father's private ledger showing Bram's been running altered brands on Silver Crown cattle for 2 years. Edmund Harroway documented it himself." "Edmund's dead," Bram said. "You can't. The ledger predates your management claim by 14 months, Vivian said. She had ridden through the herd and come out on the south side, and she was 30 feet from Bram now, sitting on the gray mare with the morning light behind her, and her father's old coat still smelling of pipe tobacco and something she couldn't name. And she looked at Bram Kessler the way she should have looked at him. The morning she tried to fire him like a woman, who was done counting what she'd lost and had started counting what she still had. "I have my father's private record," she said. "I have a first-hand brand identification from a man with 30 years in this valley. I have 2 independent ranchers who watched me open those gates and rode down with me. And I have..." She looked at the growing cluster of people on the road. However, many neighbors just rode up to see what the noise was. Bram's jaw was tight. His hands on the reins were tight. "You don't have the association," he said, but it was quieter now. "Not yet," she said, "but the association meets in about 4 hours. And I think the membership is going to want to hear what Shep has to say before they vote." One of Bram's riders had moved his horse sideways, creating distance. A small movement, barely perceptible, The kind a man makes when he's reassessing which side of an outcome he'd rather be standing on. Then another rider did the same. Bram saw it. "Those cattle," he started. "Bram," she said it cleanly, no anger, no satisfaction. Just his name, and then, "You can't make them go back in the valley." He looked at the herd, still streaming south, still moving with the momentum of 400 animals that were done being contained. Eleanor Crane's people were managing the outer edges. Pete was working the south flank. The cattle were going where cattle went when you gave them a direction and enough open ground. They were going home. Bram's hand moved toward his coat. "Don't," Cade said, flat and quiet. Bram's hand stopped. The two men looked at each other for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. In Bram's face was the particular expression of a man who has run every calculation available to him and found that all of them come out the same way. Not defeat. Not yet. Men like Bram don't arrive at defeat quickly, but the first recognition that the machine he'd built was running in reverse, and that recognition was doing something to his confidence that all the armed riders in the territory couldn't fix. He turned his horse. He rode north, back up the slope without another word. 3 of his 8 riders followed immediately, then 2 more. The remaining 3 sat their horses looking at each other, and then one of them, a young man Vivian didn't recognize, looked at her across the cattle moving between them. "Miss Harroway," he said, "I didn't know what those cattle were for." "Just hired for watching." She looked at him. He wasn't lying. She could see that. He was 19 or 20, and he'd needed work, and Bram had offered it, and he hadn't asked the right questions. "Go home," she said. He went. The 2 remaining riders looked at each other and followed him. Vivian sat on Callum's girl and watched them go, and then she turned back to the herd and the road and the gathering witnesses and the long work that was still ahead of her, and she thought, this is not over. Not even close. Then she looked up at the ridgeline. Cade Hollister was still there, small figure on a horse against the brightening sky, exactly where she'd agreed to stay. As Vivian watched, the girl raised one hand. Not a wave. Not quite. Something more deliberate than a wave. Vivian raised her hand back. Cade pulled up beside her. "She found something," he said. "What?" "I don't know yet." He was looking at his daughter on the ridge with that particular look he had, the one that was pride wrapped around, worry wrapped around something that didn't have an easy name. But when she raises her hand like that, she found something. He started up the slope. Vivian followed, and below them the cattle kept moving south. Silver Crown cattle going back to Silver Crown land, and the morning kept getting lighter. And somewhere ahead of all of them, Bram Kessler was riding north with whatever plan he had left, and the ledger was in Vivian's coat pocket, and none of it was finished. But for the first time since the night of the storm and the 3 knocks on her door, Vivian Harroway felt the weight shift. Not gone, not safe, just shifted. She rode up the slope toward Tilly, who was holding something in her hands and waiting. Tilly was holding a ledger. Not the same one Vivian had found in the tack room. This one was different. Smaller, thinner, bound in dark oilskin that had kept it waterproof through whatever weather it had sat through. Tilly held it out toward her father when they reached the ridge. Both hands. The way she offered things when she considered them important rather than just interesting. Cade took it and opened it. He read for about 30 seconds without saying anything. His face did the thing it did when information was arriving faster than he wanted to process it, a slight tightening around the eyes, jaw set, the external stillness of a man making internal adjustments. "Where did she find this?" Vivian asked. "Tilly." He looked at his daughter. "Where was this?" Tilly pointed, not vaguely, precisely at a specific location along the eastern fence line of the now empty valley below them. A post, 3rd from the right of the gate they'd come through. She made a motion with her hands, tucked inside, wrapped in something. "Inside a fence post?" Vivian said. Cade looked at the ledger again. "Hollow post. Someone packed it inside with oilskin wrapping." He turned a page. "This is Bram's handwriting." Vivian reached for it. He handed it over. The ledger was a record she had no name for it. First columns of numbers, dates, initials she didn't recognize, amounts that might be money or might be head counts. Then she started reading the pattern, and the pattern resolved into something that hit her like cold water. Names. Every name in the valley, who had cooperated with Bram's operation over 2 years, the ranchers who'd accepted Silver Crown cattle through their properties, the association members who'd looked away in exchange for favorable water agreements, the suppliers who'd cut off Silver Crown's credit. Next to each name, a dollar amount, a record of payment. Not Bram's profits, Bram's leverage. He'd kept a record of everyone he'd paid, which meant he had documentation of everyone who'd taken money to look the other way. Which meant this ledger was as much a weapon pointed at his own allies as it was evidence against him. Kept this so he could control them, Vivian said quietly. If any one of them turned on him, he could prove they took payment, Cade said. It's insurance, it's everything. She looked up. This is every name. Carver Walsh, Dunmore from the association, Delaney, the man at the county recorder's office. She turned another page. Gerald Hatch, the feed store. He paid Gerald Hatch $40 to cut Silver Crown's credit. She closed the ledger. Her hands were not shaking. They should have been shaking. If we take this to the association meeting and she looked at the sky. 2.5 hours, it changes everything, Cade said. It ends everything. She looked at him. For Bram and for every person on this list. He looked back at her. What do you want to do with it? It was a real question, not rhetorical. It was asking what she wanted, not what the obvious move was, not what would cause the most damage to the most people who deserved damaging. What she wanted. She thought about Hatch at the feed store, who'd known her father for 11 years and taken $40 to shut her out. She thought about Dunmore, standing on her porch with the provisional notice. She thought about every small rancher in this valley who'd kept his head down because Bram controlled whether his water ran and whether his cattle reached market. Some of those people were on this list because they were corrupt. Some of them were on it because they were afraid. Some of them probably couldn't have told you which reason came first. I'm going to offer them a choice, she said. They came down from the ridge with the herd still moving south below them, a steady flow of Silver Crown cattle going back to the land they'd come from. Eleanor Crane's people and the Halter brothers had the movement under control, not perfectly. A dozen animals had broken east and would need collecting later. But the main body was going in the right direction, with enough human management around it to stay coherent. Shep was waiting at the base of the slope. He'd been working the southern witnesses, the neighbors who'd ridden up from the road, walking them through the brand identification, the way he'd walked through it at the valley fence, systematic and patient, letting each person look for themselves rather than asking them to take his word. When Vivian reached him, he looked at the oilskin ledger in her hands and then at her face. How bad, he asked. Comprehensive, she said. He absorbed that. Walsh, yes. Dunmore? Yes. Hatch, yes. Shep took his hat off and ran a hand over his head and put it back on. It was the most agitated she'd seen him. Edmund knew about this too, didn't he? The payments. I think he suspected. He didn't have the names. She paused. Bram kept the names in case he ever needed them. And now you have the names. And now I have the names. Shep was quiet for a moment, looking at the cattle moving past them. What are you going to do? I'll tell you on the way to the meeting, she said. Right now I need a count of how many cattle have come down and how many witnesses are willing to go on record with what they saw, he told her. The number of witnesses was better than she'd hoped. Cattle count was still coming in, but Shep estimated north of 350 already through the southern gates and moving in the right direction. With what Silver Crown still held in its home pastures, that put the recoverable herd somewhere near 600 head. Not 800. Not what the ledger said Silver Crown should have. But enough to run a viable operation. Enough to fulfill a renegotiated contract. Enough. There was that word again. Cade, she said. He was beside her. Yes. I need someone to stay with the herd while I go to the meeting. Someone these people trust enough to finish the count and manage the cattle until I get back. He looked at the herd, at the neighbors managing its edges, at the Halter brothers and Eleanor Crane's foreman working the outer flanks. Daniel Halter will stay, he said. He's good with cattle and these people know him. And you? I'm going to the meeting with you. She hadn't asked him to. He said it like it wasn't worth discussing, because it wasn't. Tilly comes too, he said before she could raise it. She looked at Tilly, who was already sitting quietly on her horse between Shep and Roy Halter, looking serene in the specific way of a child who has decided the outcome of an argument before it starts. "Fine," Vivian said. They rode for town. The Red Willow Ranching Association met in the back room of the Grange Hall on the east end of Main Street, a functional, undecorated space with long tables pushed together and mismatched chairs and a lectern at the front that nobody had ever quite leveled properly. So whoever stood behind it spent the whole time fighting a slight rightward lean. Vivian had been to exactly one association meeting in her life, years ago brought by her father as an observer when she was 15. She remembered the room smelling of wood smoke and coffee, and the low-grade competitiveness of men who spent their working lives alone on large pieces of land, and were still figuring out how to be in the same room with each other. It smelled the same today. 23 men already seated when she walked in. Dunmore at the front, papers organized, looking like a man who had expected this to go a specific way, and was making rapid adjustments as the door opened, and Vivian Harroway walked through it, followed by Cade Hollister, Shep, and Tilly, who walked directly to a chair in the far corner and sat in it without looking at anyone. Walsh was there. Carver Walsh, who ran the largest competing operation in the valley, and who sat at the right side of the front table with the posture of someone who had already decided how the vote would go. He looked at Vivian, and then at Cade, and then at the oilskin ledger in Vivian's hands, and something shifted in his expression, not guilt, not quite. More like the alert stillness of a man who has been near explosives before and knows what they look like. Two of the small ranchers at the back of the room were men Vivian didn't recognize from Bram's ledger. Most of the others she did. Bram was not there. That absence landed in the room like a sound. Dunmore cleared his throat. "Miss Harroway, this is a closed membership meeting. As a non-member, my father was a charter member of this association," she said. "Silver Crown has been a member in continuous standing for 31 years. I am Silver Crown's owner of record, which the county recorder can confirm regardless of any provisional notice currently on file." She looked at him steadily. "I am a member." Dunmore looked at his papers. He looked at Walsh. Walsh made a small gesture that might have meant let it go, or might have meant wait. "The purpose of this meeting," Dunmore said, recovering his footing, "is to address the matter of Silver Crown's provisional status and the management dispute currently." "I'd like to address it directly," Vivian said. "If you'll give me 10 minutes. "Miss Harroway, the procedure." 10 minutes, she said. "And then you can vote on whatever you'd like." The room was quiet. 23 men, some of whom she knew, some of whom she'd never spoken to, all of them trying to read what she had in her hands and why she was calm. Walsh leaned back in his chair. "Let her speak," he said. He said it like a man granting a small favor, not like a man who was afraid of what she was about to say. That was a mistake, and Vivian watched him make it. "Thank you, Carver," she said. She told them what Shep had found at the valley fence. She described the brand alterations in specific technical terms, not because she'd known those terms 2 weeks ago, but because she'd learned them. And using them correctly in front of men who'd spent their lives reading brands had a specific effect that she'd been counting on. She told them about the ledger her father had hidden and what it documented. She told them about the cattle now being moved south down the creek road, and she told them that she had 8 witnesses prepared to testify about what they'd seen this morning. Then she set the oilskin ledger on the table. "This was found in a concealed location at the Crow's Spine Holding Valley this morning," she said. "It contains a record of payments made to individuals in this valley in exchange for facilitating, enabling, or ignoring the removal of Silver Crown cattle over the past 2 years." She paused. "Several of those individuals are in this room." The silence had a texture now. The specific density of air in a room where people have stopped breathing at their usual rate. Walsh's chair creaked as he shifted. "That's a serious allegation," Dunmore said, but his voice had dropped a register. "It's a documented record," she said, "in Bram Kessler's own handwriting, which any of you who've seen his accounting can verify." She looked slowly around the room. "I don't believe everyone on this list acted from greed. Some of you were afraid of Bram. Some of you had families and operations to protect, and he had leverage, and you took the path that seemed safest." She looked at Walsh. "And some of you knew exactly what you were doing." Walsh said nothing. "I have a proposal," she said. To every small rancher in this room who received payment, or looked away, or stayed silent because Bram made it too costly to do otherwise, I am offering immunity from civil claims by Silver Crown. If you come forward, testify truthfully about what you saw and what you received and what arrangements were made, and return any Silver Crown property currently in your possession, I will not pursue you in court. The room started talking. Not loudly, a dozen separate low conversations happening simultaneously, the particular sound of people making rapid calculations. What about the large operators? Someone asked from the back. One of the men she didn't know. He was looking at Walsh when he said it. The immunity offer applies to small operators who were coerced or who had limited choice, Vivian said. It does not apply to anyone who actively organized or profited significantly from the theft. Those cases will go to the county courts. Walsh stood up. He was a tall man, and he used the height deliberately. This is an attempt to intimidate this associations. Sit down, Carver. The voice came the back of the room. Everyone turned. Eleanor Crane had come in while Vivian was talking. She stood in the doorway with her gray hair pinned back and her riding coat still dusty from the morning. And she looked at Walsh with the specific composure of a woman who had been dismissed from this room too many times to be interested in how he felt about her presence. I was in that valley this morning, she said. I saw those cattle. I watched Shep read the brands. She walked to the front of the room and stood beside Vivian. And I'm prepared to testify that the association's vote 2 seasons ago, revoking my shared grazing rights, was based on false information provided by Bram Kessler to benefit his own operation. She looked at Dunmore. And I'd like to know who on the compliance committee authorized that vote, because the names in that ledger might help me remember. Dunmore had stopped shuffling his papers. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at a point somewhere between the table's surface and the floor. One of the small ranchers near the back of the room stood up. Vivian didn't know his name. He was maybe 50, weathered face, the particular look of a man who has been uncomfortable for a long time and has finally decided that the discomfort of speaking up is less than the discomfort of staying quiet. I received $40, he said, last spring. Bram said it was a water agreement fee. I didn't ask what it was for. He sat back down and looked at his hands. I knew, I just didn't ask. Silence, then another man stood. I let cattle move through my south pasture 3 times last fall. Bram told me they were strays being returned. I didn't check the brands. He stayed standing. I should have checked. Then another. Then 2 more in quick succession, both from the east side of the valley, both with stories that were variations on the same theme, Bram offering something they needed, a pressure lifted or a payment made, and a deliberate choice not to ask the question that would have made it impossible to accept. Walsh was still standing. He had the look of a man watching an army desert. This is he started. Carver, Dunmore said it quietly. Walsh looked at him. Dunmore shook his head once. Just once. Walsh sat down. It wasn't defeat, not yet. It was the moment before defeat, when a man stops fighting the tide and starts calculating how far it can actually reach. I move, said one of the men who'd just testified, still on his feet, that the provisional status on Silver Crown's operations be lifted immediately, and the original management claim filed by Bram Kessler be referred to the county courts for fraud review. Seconded, said Eleanor Crane. Dunmore looked around the room. His face had the particular blankness of a man who has realized the procedure he was supposed to run has been replaced by a different procedure, and that the best thing available to him now is to run the new procedure correctly. All in favor, he said. 19 hands went up. 3 men didn't vote Walsh, and 2 others she'd identified from the ledger as significant operators who'd benefited substantially. Those cases would go to the county courts, as she'd said. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The 4th man who didn't vote was young, maybe 25, and he was looking at Vivian with an expression she recognized from Pete's face at the gate, someone deciding which direction to stand in before the moment closed. After a second, he raised his hand. 20 votes. Dunmore recorded it without inflection. Motion carries. The room started moving chairs, voices, the particular organized chaos of a meeting that had gone somewhere nobody planned for. Vivian stood at the front table while men came forward, some of them to shake her hand, Some of them with the complex body language of people who had testified against their own interests and weren't sure yet what that meant for them. Some of them just trying to get out of the room. Shep appeared beside her. Walsh is leaving. I see him. Are you going to? No. She watched Walsh move toward the door, his two associates close behind. He knows what's in that ledger. He knows the county courts are going to see it. Whatever he does with the next few hours of his life is his business. She watched the door close behind him. Let him go. Shep gave her a long look. Your father would have done the same thing, he said. Let him walk. He always said the courts were for permanent problems. She didn't answer. She wasn't thinking about what her father would have done. She was thinking about the next problem, which was already forming. Cade was beside her. The county sheriff is going to need to be notified today, he said, before Bram decides to put distance between himself and this territory. I know. She looked at him. Will you go? Take Shep and the oilskin ledger to the sheriff's office directly from here. I'll stay and finish with the association. What about? Tilly stays with me. She said it before he could ask. She didn't know why exactly. It felt right in a way she didn't examine. She'll be fine. Cade looked at his daughter in the corner, who had spent the entire meeting sitting quietly in that chair, looking at everyone with those cataloging eyes, filing everything. He looked at Vivian. All right, he said. He took the oilskin ledger from her. He took Shep. They went. The next 2 hours were the most exhausting of the entire week, which was saying something, because the week had included a night ride to a hidden valley and a cattle drive at dawn. Vivian sat at the long association table with Dunmore and worked through the formal documentation, the association's withdrawal of the provisional status, the referral letter to the county courts, the record of the morning's testimony. Dunmore was efficient and thorough, which she might have found impressive under different circumstances. Under these circumstances, she understood that his efficiency was partly motivated by a desire to establish that he had acted correctly once the facts were clear, which was not exactly courage, but she would take it. 3 of the men who'd testified came back with additional information. One of them produced a receipt Bram had given him handwritten, signed, for water access arrangement, which became part of the documentation. Another brought a letter, 2 months old, instructing him to route a batch of cattle through his eastern property on a specific date, using a specific trail. Bram had apparently trusted his leverage enough to put instructions in writing. That was the particular hubris of a man who has never been seriously challenged, Vivian thought. He had built such a complete machine that he'd stopped worrying about the parts. Tilly sat in her corner. At some point, Dottie Pierce appeared. Vivian had no idea how the cook had heard about the meeting or gotten to town, but Dottie appeared and sat next to Tilly and produced, from somewhere in her coat, 2 biscuits and an apple, which she shared with the child without comment. Tilly ate both biscuits and gave Dottie half the apple back, which was apparently an acceptable arrangement between them. At noon, the first concrete news from the sheriff's office arrived in the form of one of the Halter brothers, Roy, who'd ridden back from the cattle drive to report on the herd and ended up being the messenger for everything else, too. Sheriff rode out to Bram's property this morning, Roy said. Bram was already gone. Took his personal horses and his personal ledgers and 2 of his remaining hands. Left everything else. Vivian processed that. He ran. Looks that way. Sheriff sent word to Casper and Cheyenne. He can't get far before someone picks him up, assuming the telegraphs work and someone's actually watching for him. Roy looked like he didn't entirely trust that assumption, but was keeping it to himself. Cattle? She asked. Coming in fine. Daniel's got them moving. Your south pastures are going to be full by late afternoon. He paused. Miss Crane's foreman counted what he could identify as Silver Crown originals he made at 412 head. But there's another 60 or 70 in there that might be Miss Crane's strays from 2 seasons ago. She's going to want a brand review. She'll get one, Vivian said. Whatever's hers goes back to her. Roy nodded. He was looking at her in a way she was starting to recognize the slightly surprised look that people kept getting, like they'd expected her to be less than she was and were adjusting on the fly. She had made her peace with it. The adjusting was their work to do, not hers to manage. One more thing, Roy said. Those fraudulent management documents, Bram, filed at the county recorder. The recorder's office sent over a note. The man who notarized them is also on your ledger list. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat. He came in this morning and filed a retraction of the notarization. Before you even got to the meeting. She took the paper. Read it. The retraction was formal and complete, and signed with the slightly over-precise signature of a man who had spent a sleepless night with a lawyer. He found his own counsel fast, she said. Turns out Bram leaving in the night scared people, Roy said. When the man running the machine picks up and runs, the people who built it with him start looking for exits. Dunmore, working beside her, said nothing. But he also didn't look up from his documents, which told her something about the direction of his own thinking. Thank you, Roy, she said. He left. She sat for a moment with the retraction in her hands. The fraudulent management claim that had been the foundational piece of everything Bram had built, that given him legal cover, that had frozen her contracts, that had given the association grounds for the provisional status was void. Had been void from the moment the notarization was retracted. Silver Crown was fully, formally, unambiguously hers. It had always been hers, but now the paperwork knew it too. Cade came back in the early afternoon, and he came in looking like a man who had delivered difficult information to an official, and then stood around answering questions for 2 hours. He sat down at the table across from Vivian and accepted the coffee she pushed toward him and drank half of it before he spoke. Sheriff has the ledger, he said. He sent the telegram to Casper. He's not hopeful about catching Bram, quickly thinks he had a head start of several hours, but the formal warrant is filed and it'll follow him wherever he goes. Roy told me he ran fast. Cade set the cup down. His operation on the north side, the property he used as a base, the so-called ranch he was building, with stolen money, the sheriff went through it this morning. Found account books. 3 years of transactions, all of it documented. Money going out to various ranches as payment for cooperation. Money coming in from cattle sales, all of it in Bram's handwriting. He looked at her. Kept very good records. For leverage, she said. And because he thought he was untouchable, Cade was quiet for a moment. There's enough there to build a complete case, even without Bram in custody. Even if he never comes back to this territory, what he did here is documented. Courts can proceed. Walsh? His lawyer was at the sheriff's office when I got there. Cade's voice didn't change. He's cooperating. His lawyer is calling it providing information in the context of a potential misunderstanding of business arrangements. Is that what they're calling it? It's what the lawyer is calling it. Walsh himself didn't say much. He looked at his coffee cup. He knows what he did. He just doesn't want to know it out loud. He'll answer to the courts, Vivian said. Yes. She looked at the table. At the papers. At the long day she could feel in her back and her legs, and the particular gritty exhaustion behind her eyes. How's the herd? Daniel says 430 identified Silver Crown head are through the south gate and in your pastures. Another 60-odd under review. He paused. You're going to need crew. Real crew, not just what you've got. Pete and Shep and the remaining hands can't manage what's coming in. I know. She thought about this. The men who left when Bram walked out, some of them went with him because he told them to. Some of them went because they thought he'd already won, and they wanted to be on the winning side. She looked up. I'm not going to go looking for them, but if they come back on their own, I'll hear them out. Cade raised an eyebrow slightly. That's more generous than most people would be. Most people haven't spent 2 weeks learning how a ranch actually runs, she said. I need experienced hands, and I'm not going to get them from thin air. The ones who come back will come back because they've made a choice, which is more than Bram could say for the ones who left. He was quiet, considering this. You still need a foreman, he said. There was something careful in the way he said it. Not quite casual. The deliberate quality of a word placed where it was meant to be noticed. I know I need a foreman, she said. She met his eyes. I was thinking about making the position official. In writing. Full authority for ranch operations, reporting directly to me, reviewed quarterly. She paused. Are you interested? The thing his face did was not what she expected. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Acceptance, maybe. The practical nod of a man taking a job he was already doing. What she got instead was something more complicated. and it moved through his expression and was gone before she could fully read it. "I'll think about it," he said. She stared at him. "You'll think about it?" "Yes." "Cade, you've been running my ranch for 10 days. "I've been helping you run it," he said. "That's different." He picked up his coffee. "Give me a day." She looked at him for a long moment. Something about the way he'd said it, the care behind the words, the particular precision of helping you run it versus running it, told her there was more underneath the answer than the answer. She didn't push. "One day," she said. He nodded and looked past her, and she followed his look. Tilly had fallen asleep in the corner chair. She was curled sideways with Dottie's coat over her, her face slack and young in sleep in a way it wasn't when she was awake, all the alertness gone out of it, replaced by something that was just a tired 9-year-old who had been up since before dawn, doing things that most adults wouldn't have done. Cade looked at his daughter asleep in the corner of the ranching association meeting room with the particular expression he had when he looked at Tilly and thought nobody was watching, not the managed expression, not the father being competent expression, but the one underneath those, which was just a man looking at the only thing in the world that was completely irreplaceable to him. "She'll sleep for 3 hours," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone wake her." "I won't," Vivian said. He stood and went over and adjusted the coat slightly on Tilly's shoulder, a gesture so automatic it clearly wasn't a thought, just what his hands did, and then he went out the back door of the Grange Hall to check on the cattle. Vivian watched him go. Dunmore cleared his throat softly beside her. "Miss Harroway, there are a few more items to formalize. Whenever you're ready." "Yes," she said, turning back to the table. "Let's finish it." By late afternoon, Silver Crown's south pastures held more cattle than they'd held in over a year, and the count was still settling. Pete had stationed himself at the gate with a tally stick, marking each animal through, and by the time the light started changing, he had 471 Silver Crown identified head and 63 under review. The 63 were a problem to solve tomorrow, not today. Vivian stood on the south rise above the main pasture and watched the cattle spread across the grass below her in the long evening light. They weren't organized. They weren't in any particular section. They were just cattle in a pasture, doing what cattle do when you give them grass and water and space spreading out, heads down, the low, collective sound of animals that are not being asked to do anything in particular. She had not cried once in 2 weeks. She had been angry, frightened, exhausted, running on not enough sleep and too much coffee, and the specific fuel that comes from refusing to accept an outcome you haven't earned. She had not cried. She stood on the rise in her father's borrowed coat and looked at the cattle, and her throat did something complicated. And she let it do it because there was nobody immediately watching, and because she had earned the private version of this moment, even if she didn't have time for the public one. Edmund Harroway's cattle, Edmund Harroway's land, Edmund Harroway's silver crown mark on 471 animals standing in the evening light below her. She had gotten them back. Not all of them. Not the ones that had already been sold and moved and were beyond retrieving. But most of them. Enough of them. And the rest, the money, the contracts, the legal standing, all of that was coming back behind the cattle, through courts and association records and the slow machinery of formal consequence. She pulled the coat tighter and let herself have 60 seconds of this, the same 60 seconds she'd allowed herself on the porch the morning after Bram walked out. Just 60. Then she'd go back down and work. She was on 45 when she heard footsteps behind her. Tilly. The girl had woken up from her corner sleep and found her way here without being told where here was, which meant she'd asked someone or she'd just known, and with Tilly it was genuinely hard to tell the difference. She came and stood beside Vivian on the rise, not touching, not speaking, looking down at the cattle the same way Vivian was looking at them. They stood there together for a while. Then Tilly reached out and put her hand in Vivian's. Not a childish grip, not the way a child reaches for an adult because they're uncertain or scared. Something more deliberate than that. Something that felt like a statement. Vivian closed her hand around Tilly's. They stayed until the light went gold, and the cattle below them were dark shapes against the grass, and the first stars started appearing over the eastern ridge. "We should go in," Vivian said finally. Tilly nodded. They went down together. Cade was in the yard talking to Pete, about the morning schedule, what needed doing first, what could wait, how many hands they'd need for the brand review versus the pasture management. He was making a list on the back of a fence record because there was no clean paper available, which was the kind of thing that happened when you were running an operation with 12 people and no supply credit and a barn that had burned last week. He looked up when they came into the yard. He looked at Vivian's face and then at Tilly beside her, their hands still linked, and his expression did something she didn't fully catch before he looked back at Pete and finished his sentence. "Get Shep to do the east section in the morning," he said. "He knows the terrain better than anyone." "Yes, sir," Pete said, and went. Cade looked at Vivian. "How are you?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that. After 2 weeks of big questions with complicated answers, it was strange to have a simple one feel hard. "Tired," she said, "and something else I don't have a good word for." "Something good or something bad?" She considered. "Good, I think. Mostly." She looked at the cattle in the south pasture, just visible in the growing dark. "Like I've been running a very long race, and I've just realized I'm still on my feet, and I'm not sure yet whether that's because I'm strong or because I was too stubborn to fall down." Cade looked at her. His face had that careful quality again, the one that meant he was choosing words precisely. "Those aren't different things," he said. She looked at him. "Being stubborn enough not to fall down," he said. "That's what strong looks like in most situations. At least the situations that matter." She let that settle. The evening was going quiet around them, the yard sounds winding down, the cattle settling, the day finishing itself in the way that days do regardless of what happened in them. "One day," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "You asked for one day to think about the foreman position," she said. That clock started this afternoon. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of one. "I know when it started," he said. "Good." She let go of Tilly's hand, who immediately went to stand beside her father, pressing against his arm the way she sometimes did when the day had been long. "I'll see you both in the morning." She went inside. Dottie had dinner ready, which under the circumstances was remarkable, and Vivian sat at the long kitchen table and ate it without tasting most of it, because her brain was still processing the day and had not sent word to her mouth that food was happening. Amos sat across from her and did the same thing. They ate in companionable silence. After dinner, she went to the office and sat at her father's desk, and looked at the wall. She had work to do. The fall delivery contract needed to be renegotiated with the Cheyenne stockyards. The provisional notice on Silver Crown's business operations needed formal removal, which meant a letter to the county recorder, with the association's voiding document attached. She needed to write to Silver Crown's original lawyer, her family's lawyer, not Bram's Casper man, about the fraud case and what documentation they'd need for the courts. She had the list in her head, and it was long. She looked at the wall for another 5 minutes. Then she picked up the pen. She wrote until midnight. The lamp held. The work was real and solid and had clear edges, which was what she needed after a day of things with no clear edges at all. At midnight, she stopped and put the pen down and looked at what she'd done. 6 letters, 4 formal documents, 2 pages of operational notes for the morning. She folded them in order, capped the ink, put out the lamp. In the dark, she sat for one more moment. Silver Crown was hers. The cattle were in the pasture. Bram Kessler was a fugitive with a warrant following him, and the people who had helped him were answering for it, and the association vote that had been designed to bury her had instead become the first brick in the foundation of something else. Tomorrow there would be more work, more problems. The recovery of a ranch this size didn't happen in a day or a week or a month, and she knew that now in the specific way you know a thing when you've lived through the beginning of it. But tonight Silver Crown stood. She got up and went to bed. Cade's one day turned into 2, and on the morning of the second day he came to the office before breakfast and set his hat on the corner of her desk and sat down. "I'll take the position," he said. Vivian looked up from the supply ledger she'd been rebuilding from scratch. "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment, not stalling, just being honest with himself before he was honest with her. "Nothing changed. I just needed to make sure I was saying yes to the right thing." "What's the right thing?" "The job. Just the job." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Between those two sentences was a larger conversation that neither of them was ready to have, and they both knew it, and they let it sit there without forcing it. "All right," she said. "The position is yours." She wrote it out on silver crown letterhead that afternoon: foreman's contract, terms clear, wages fair, reviewed quarterly, as she'd said. She signed it and slid it across the desk, and he picked it up and read the whole thing, every line which she respected. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "When does it start?" he asked. "It started 12 days ago," she said. "The paperwork is just catching up." Picked up his hat. "I'm going to need 2 more experienced hands before the brand review tomorrow. I'll ride to the Halter Brothers this afternoon." Daniel mentioned he knew a couple of men looking for work. "Take Pete with you. Pete's doing the east fence. Take Shep. Shep's 63. Shep is fine, and you know it," she said, and went back to the ledger. He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't argument either, and she heard him leave, and she sat at the desk and let herself feel the particular solid weight of a decision made and held and not regretted. The brand review took 3 days. Vivian had not anticipated how much labor the review required, moving animals through a narrow chute, examining each brand, documenting the original mark, the alteration mark, and the current condition of the animal itself. Shep ran the process with the methodical patience of a man who had done difficult work his entire life and saw no reason to rush it toward inaccuracy. 2 new hands Cade had hired, brothers named Aldous and Frank Bright, who'd worked the Cheyenne drives for a decade, knew their craft and did what Shep asked without friction. On the afternoon of the second review day, Eleanor Crane arrived with her foreman and stood at the chute while Shep identified 11 animals bearing her original brand underneath Bram's alteration. She watched each one come through without speaking until the last one, and then she said, "That's my bull. That's my Red Canyon bull. He went missing 18 months ago, and Bram told me he'd probably gotten into the northern range and died in the winter." Shep looked at the bull. The bull was 5 years old and in excellent condition, and clearly had not died in any winter. "He's yours, Mrs. Crane," Shep said. Eleanor pressed her lips together. She looked at the bull for a long moment, and in her face was the complicated arithmetic of a woman who had absorbed a loss and built around it, and was now being asked to rebuild around its return. "Thank you," she said to Vivian. "He was yours," Vivian said. "I just found him." Eleanor Crane looked at her the direct, measuring look of a woman who doesn't give respect easily because she has never been asked to give it, and so has never developed a reflex for it. "Your father was a good man," she said. "You're proving out." It was not warm. It was not a compliment the way most people use the word. It was something better, an honest assessment from a person who did not offer dishonest ones. Vivian took it for what it was. Bram Kessler was arrested in Laramie 11 days after he left Red Willow Valley. He had made it farther than the sheriff had expected, which surprised nobody who had spent time understanding how thoroughly he'd planned everything else. He had cash, a significant amount of it, accumulated from 2 years of cattle sales, and the money various cooperating ranchers had paid back to him in the arrangement he'd built. He had new horses. He had apparently been heading for the territorial border with the intention of becoming someone else's problem in someone else's jurisdiction. He almost made it. A telegraph to the Laramie Sheriff's Office, cross-referenced against a description from the Casper office, put 2 deputies on his trail 40 miles outside of town. He didn't run when they found him, which the Red Willow sheriff reported with a note of faint surprise. He simply stopped his horse and got down and submitted to arrest with the contained expression of a man who had always known this was one of the possible outcomes and had decided some time ago that he would meet it without performing. Whatever else Bram Kessler was, he was not a man who panicked. Vivian received the news from the sheriff's deputy, who rode out to Silver Crown with the official report. She read it, thanked the deputy, offered him coffee, which he declined, and went back to the supply inventory she'd been conducting. Cade found her there an hour later. "You heard," he said. "Yes." He watched her continue writing figures in the inventory book. "That's it? Just yes?" She looked up. "What else would there be?" He didn't answer immediately. He was learning that she did this, sometimes processed large things quietly and completely, and arrived at a settled place that could look like indifference to someone who hadn't watched her arrive there. I thought you might want to talk about it, he said. I might, she said, later. She went back to the figures. Right now I want to finish this inventory, because we're 3 weeks from the fall drive, and I need to know exactly what we have and what we still need. Cade sat down on the supply room floor. There was no chair and leaned against the wall. Then I'll sit with you while you work. She didn't tell him to leave. He sat there for an hour while she worked, not talking, occasionally answering the questions she directed at him about herd condition and drive logistics. And it was one of the stranger and more comfortable hours she'd had in recent memory. When she finished the inventory, she set down the pen and looked at him on the floor. Planned everything, she said. 2 years. Every piece of it. He was smarter than I gave him credit for, and more patient than almost anyone I've met. Yes, Cade said. And he's still lost, yes. She thought about what she wanted to say next, and then she said it plainly, because she'd learned that plainness was more efficient than most things, and she was an efficient person. I don't think intelligence and patience are enough. I think he believed the machine he built was stronger than the people inside it. That was his mistake. He understood operations, but he didn't understand that eventually people get tired of being part of someone else's machine and start making their own choices. She paused. My father wrote things down. Shep stayed when he could have left. Roy Halter testified when it would have been easier not to. Tilly found a ledger in a hollow fence post. She looked at the inventory book. A machine couldn't do any of that. That's all just people deciding. Cade was quiet for a moment. You're not angry at him. I'm furious at him, she said. But angry and angry at him specifically are different things. One is useful and one just takes up space. He looked at her with that expression she still hadn't fully cataloged, the one that wasn't quite admiration, because it was more specific than that, more focused on a particular thing she'd said or done rather than on the general fact of her. Come have dinner, he said, standing up. Dottie made something with a lot of onions, and I've been smelling it for an hour. She put the inventory away and went to dinner. The fall drive happened in the 3rd week of October, 6 weeks after the cattle came back from Crow's Spine Valley. It was smaller than Silver Crown's drives had been in previous years, 420 head to Cheyenne, a renegotiated contract that Vivian had spent 3 days working out with the stockyard's buyer, a man named Pressler, who had been skeptical on the first day and professional on the second, and, by the third, privately impressed in the way that people from outside a situation sometimes see it more clearly than the people inside it. You're not what I was expecting, he'd told her on the 3rd day. What were you expecting, honestly? A lawyer and a lot of demands. I have a lawyer, she said. I left him in Red Willow. Pressler had laughed. They'd shaken hands on a contract that was lower than the previous year's fixed price but fair for the actual herd size, with a clause for renegotiation next season based on Silver Crown's recovery trajectory. The drive itself took 8 days. Vivian rode with it. This was not universally expected. Aldous and Frank Bright, who had come on as permanent hands, had been tactful enough not to say anything directly. But she'd caught the exchange of glances on the first morning when she appeared at the drive lineup in her father's coat with her own horse saddled. Shep had made no expression whatsoever, which with Shep meant he was either completely unsurprised or actively approving. Pete had grinned. Cade had looked at her and then at the drive setup and said, "You're on the east flank. Keep about 30 yards between you and the outer animals. Push anything that breaks back in. Don't let them get into the tree line." I know, she said. I know you know, he said. I'm just telling you anyway. 8 days on the drive was 8 days of every discomfort a Wyoming October could produce: cold mornings, wet afternoons. One genuinely bad night where the temperature dropped past what any of them had a coat for, and they built fires and sat close, and nobody pretended it wasn't miserable. The cattle were difficult on the 4th day when they hit the open plains section and had too much room, and the wind came from the wrong direction. Vivian lost 3 animals into a draw and spent 40 minutes with Pete getting them back, and by the time I had them, she was mud to the knee, and her horse was irritated with her. She did not lose any others for the remaining 4 days. Pressler met them at the Cheyenne yards, and his people ran the count twice, which was standard, and both counts came out the same. Silver Crown, 420 head. Delivered on time, animals in acceptable condition, contract fulfilled. Pressler shook her hand again. She rode home. She had not entirely understood, until she came back from Cheyenne, what returning to Silver Crown felt like after having earned the right to return to it. It was the same land, same gate, same yard, same house with the same porch where she'd stood watching 31 men ride away. Dottie had kept everything running in her absence, with the calm authority of a woman who had managed large households through larger crises than this one. The home pastures were in order. The remaining cattle were in good condition. The new water gate was working correctly. Everything was the same and nothing felt the same, because she wasn't the same. She sat on the porch that evening with a cup of coffee and looked at Silver Crown in the early dark, the lights from the bunkhouse, the sound of horses in the stable, the particular quiet of a working ranch at day's end, and she tried to understand what had changed. It wasn't the ownership. She had legally owned Silver Crown the whole time, even when Bram was doing his level best to make that ownership meaningless. It wasn't the money, which had never been the problem. It wasn't even winning, because she was honest enough with herself to know that winning was partly luck. Luck that Tilly had gone into tack rooms. Luck that the ridge approach had been unmapped enough to remain unknown. Luck that enough people in the valley had reached their own limit with Bram at exactly the right moment. What had changed was what she knew. She knew what the Watergate mechanism felt like when it was adjusted wrong. She knew how to read a brand alteration from 15 feet in dim light. She knew which pasture sections held water longest in a dry stretch and which ones needed supplemental feed first in hard winters. She knew that fence cuts have different edges depending on the tool and the intention. She knew that cattle move through timber differently than they move through open grass, and that the difference mattered. She knew Silver Crown now, not as an inheritance, not as a financial asset that generated returns she reviewed quarterly from an office. She knew it the way her father had known it, as a living thing, with needs and patterns and 1,000 daily decisions that nobody else could make if she wasn't there to make them. That was what Bram had never understood for all his planning. He had understood operations. He had not understood that there was a difference between operating a ranch and knowing one. Porch door opened, and Tilly came out with a blanket and sat on the step below Vivian. She pulled her knees up and wrapped the blanket around herself and looked out at the yard the same way Vivian was looking at it. They had a habit by now of sitting together without filling the quiet. It had developed naturally, the way real habits do not decide it on, just become. "You did good while I was gone," Vivian said. Tilly looked up at her. "Shep said you checked the east pasture water levels every morning," Vivian said, "and that you told Pete about the section of fence that was going loose before it actually went." Tilly shrugged. The shrug of someone who doesn't understand why you'd do anything differently. "When you're ready," Vivian said carefully, "I'd like to start teaching you the ledgers. The real ones. How to read them, how to keep them, how to catch when the numbers don't match the counts." Tilly was still. "You don't have to decide now," Vivian said. "I just want you to know it's there." Tilly looked at the yard for a while. Then she turned slightly and looked at Vivian with those cataloging eyes that never really stopped recording, and she nodded. Once, deliberate. Vivian nodded back. They sat until the coffee was cold, and the yard was fully dark, and the stars were doing what stars do over open country, putting on more of themselves than you can see anywhere that's been built up too much, spreading edge to edge in a way that makes the sky feel like a second landscape above the first one. Cade came out eventually. He almost always did when Tilly and Vivian were on the porch, not to interrupt, just to be present, which was something she'd come to understand was how he showed that things mattered to him. He sat on the rail and said nothing for a while. "Pressler sent a letter," he said finally. "Already?" Ryder came this afternoon. "He's interested in a multi-season supply arrangement. Fixed price, guaranteed delivery, reviewed annually." He looked at her. "He wrote that Silver Crown's herd quality was better than the contract suggested, and that he'd like a first option agreement for next season." Vivian thought about this. "What do you think?" "I think it's good business. But," he looked at the dark yard, "multi-season agreements require stable operations. You've got the herd, you've got the land. You're still short on experienced crew, and the bunkhouse needs work before winter, and the legal case against Bram is going to require your attention at intervals for the next year or two. All of that is manageable. Yes, he said. I'm not arguing against it. I just want you to go in clear-eyed. I'm always clear-eyed. You're usually clear-eyed, he corrected. Occasionally you see what you want to see and call it assessment. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the mild expression of a man who has just said a true thing and is comfortable waiting for the response. Name one time, she said. The first time you tried to turn the cattle toward the southern fence line on the drive. You saw the terrain as flat. I told you there was a slope in the last 50 yards. You said you couldn't see a slope. There was barely a slope. There was enough slope that we lost 4 animals into the draw before you corrected. I got 3 of them back. You did, he said. Eventually. She looked out at the yard. The corner of her mouth moved. I'll consider the Pressler agreement. That's all I asked. Tilly had fallen asleep on the step between them, which she occasionally did when she'd been awake since before dawn. She was half leaning against the porch post with the blanket still around her breathing slow and even, her face doing the young and slack thing it did in sleep. Cade looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Vivian. She asked me something last week, he said. What? He was quiet a moment, choosing how to say it. She asked me if we were staying. The word landed differently than she expected. Not just its surface meaning, but its weight. The weight of a question a child only asks when she already knows what staying means to her and is afraid of what the answer might be. Vivian looked at Tilly asleep on the step. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't know yet. He said it evenly, which was honest. And now he was quiet. Cade. I have a foreman's contract, he said carefully. A fair one. That tells me I'm here through at least the review period. Everything else, he stopped. She turned and looked at him directly, which sometimes worked on him when careful words didn't. He looked back at her, and in his face was the thing that was usually behind the practical, managed face, the thing about the Nebraska spread that was gone, about the wife who'd died fast while he was somewhere else, about a 1.5 years of traveling with a silent daughter, and too much of his own company. He was afraid. Not of her, not of Silver Crown, not of the work. He was afraid of wanting something that was real, and not being able to trust the wanting, because the last real things he'd had gone away, in ways he hadn't been able to prevent or prepare for. That was something she understood. Not the same loss, not the same shape, but the same fear underneath it that wanting something clearly was a way of setting yourself up to lose it clearly. I'm not going to give you a speech, she said. Good. I'm going to tell you one practical thing. He waited. Silver Crown needs a foreman who isn't going to leave, she said. Not because I can't find another one eventually, because the ranch needs consistency, and the crew needs to trust that the person above them is going to be there in the morning. She paused. I need to know you're here because you've decided to be here, not because you're between decisions. I'm here, he said. I know you're here right now. I'm asking about Vivian. He said it quietly. I'm here. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise of the romantic kind that people make in stories and then have to live up to in the complicated reality that follows. It was a statement of fact from a man who chose his facts carefully and didn't offer them lightly. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. He nodded. He looked at Tilly. I'm going to carry her in. I know. He gathered his daughter up from the porch step, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times the way Tilly rearranged herself in sleep to accommodate being carried, leaning into her father's shoulder without waking. Carried her inside. Vivian heard the bunkhouse door open and close. She sat on the porch alone for a while longer. The coffee was cold, and she drank the last of it anyway. She was thinking about her father's note in the hidden ledger. She will find it when she is ready to look. He had meant the ledger, probably. The documentation, the evidence. He had hidden it and trusted that she would eventually look in the right place. But she thought he might have also meant something bigger than a book. Edmund Harroway had spent his life building something. A ranch, yes, cattle and land and water rights and the accumulated knowledge of decades. But also something less tangible, which was the particular understanding of what it meant to work at something you believed in. To show up every morning and do the specific difficult thing in front of you rather than the idea of the thing, which is so much easier to love. He had never found a way to give her that directly. You can't hand someone that kind of knowing. You can only leave the conditions for them to arrive at it themselves in their own time, through their own difficulty. She had arrived at it, later than he'd probably hoped, through a crisis he probably hadn't planned on, with the unexpected help of a weathered cowboy and his watchful daughter. She was here. She was on the other side of it. She understood now why her father had stayed on this land for 30 years. Why he'd chosen early mornings and hard winters and the endless, specific work of a living operation over the easier life his money could have bought him somewhere else. It wasn't that he didn't have other options. It was that none of the other options were this particular soil under these particular stars. These animals with their slow animal certainty. The morning when you ride out and the grass is wet, and the cattle are where you left them, and the water gate is working right, and the count comes out the same as yesterday. And none of that is exciting in any way, and all of it is exactly what you need. She had her father's coat on. She had her father's desk inside, and her father's ledgers, and her father's brand, on 471 animals in the south pasture. And she had something her father hadn't been able to give her, or arrange for her, or leave, written in any margin, the knowledge that she had fought for it, and survived the fighting, and was still standing on the other side. That was hers. Entirely. Spring came to Red Willow Valley in the way Wyoming springs come reluctant at first, then sudden, like someone who has been debating a decision and finally commits to it all at once. The snow went from the south pastures in a week. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. The cattle moved back to the good grass sections, with the enthusiasm of animals that understood seasons even if they couldn't explain them. The courts had been working through the winter on the fraud case, and by early spring the first verdicts were in. Walsh received a judgment that stripped him of his two most productive north pastures, the ones he'd built using money from the Bram arrangement, and required repayment of proceeds to Silver Crown, totaling 3 years of diverted cattle value. He didn't contest it. His lawyer had apparently advised him that contesting would produce worse results, and Walsh, for all his faults, was a practical man. Dunmore had resigned from the Association Compliance Committee in November and spent the winter cooperating with the court's investigation. His cooperation earned him a lesser judgment, a formal censure, a financial penalty, a 5-year bar from association office. He accepted all of it without visible emotion, which Vivian thought was either genuine remorse or the performance of it, and she was not certain it mattered which. Bram Kessler's case took longer, as cases of that complexity always do. His lawyers, he had hired good ones. Using money he'd had the foresight to put somewhere courts couldn't easily reach, fought every element of the documentation. But Edmund Harroway's hidden ledger was dated and specific, and in a handwriting that 3 people independently verified, and the oilskin ledger from the hollow fence post was Bram's own handwriting documenting his own payments. And the brand alterations on 412 recovered animals were visible to anyone Shep walked through the evidence with. The case did not go well for Bram Kessler. Vivian was not there for the final judgment, which came in a Casper courtroom in late March. She was in Silver Crown's south pasture when the news arrived, doing something that had nothing to do with helping Aldous Bright move a group of yearlings to a new section. 2-hour job that required patience and the willingness to be wrong about which direction the animals wanted to go and correct without frustration. She was doing it badly at first and then better, and by the end of it she was doing it well enough that Aldous, who was not a man who offered comments on other people's technique, said, "You've got an eye for it." Thanked him. The deputy rode up while she was washing her hands at the water trough. 12-year sentence. Fraud, theft, criminal conspiracy. Property Bram had built with stolen money was ordered sold, the proceeds distributed to the parties he'd damaged, according to a schedule the court had worked out. Silver Crown was near the top of that schedule. She read the document twice. Handed it back. Thanked the deputy. She went back to the yearlings. The association meeting in May was the first one Vivian attended as a full voting member, not as a supplicant or a combatant or a woman standing at the front of the room making a case. She sat in the body of the meeting with Eleanor Crane on one side and Roy Halter on the other and participated in the normal, procedural, largely undramatic business of a working ranching association water schedule adjustments. Shared fence agreements, drive timing coordination. At the end of the meeting, Dunmore's replacement on the compliance committee, a new man, Elected in the fall stood up and announced that the association was holding elections for the following year's leadership positions, and that the president's seat was open since Walsh's successor had served his temporary term and declined to stand again. Vivian had not planned what happened next. She had genuinely not thought about it before this moment, which was the only explanation for why she raised her hand when she didn't think she was going to. The room went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when something unexpected happens, and everyone is waiting to see if it's real. "I'd like to put my name forward," she said. 23 faces looked at her. Eleanor Crane beside her said nothing, but she shifted her weight slightly, the particular shift of a woman settling in for something. Roy Halter, on her other side, raised his hand. "I'd like to second the nomination." The vote was held the following month, after a nomination period that produced 2 other candidates, both men, both experienced, both known quantities in the valley. One of them was Shep, who had declined when she'd suggested it, and then looked surprised when she'd suggested it, and then looked more surprised when the association had seconded the idea without her. "You shouldn't have done that," Shep told her afterward. "You're the most respected man in this valley," she said. "And you said no. So either you run against me and we find out which of us the association trusts more, or you endorse me and we stop arguing. Those aren't the only 2 options. They're the only 2 I'm offering." He had looked at her with the expression of a man being managed by someone who learned the technique from watching him use it, which was uncomfortable and apparently also effective. He endorsed her. She won by 11 votes. The evening after the election, Cade found her at the desk, her father's desk. Hers now, fully hers in a way that had stopped requiring the reminder, and he stood in the doorway with his hat and looked at her with something that was more than the everyday expression. Something that had been building for a while and had apparently decided this was the moment. "President of the Red Willow Ranching Association," he said. "Acting," she said, "until the formal installation in September." Still what? He came in and set his hat on the corner of the desk and stood across from her. "I've been working for a lot of people. I told you that in the beginning. I've worked for men who owned twice what you own and didn't know a quarter of what you know about what they owned. Is that a compliment? I'm getting there." He wasn't quite looking at her, which was unusual. He was looking at the hat on the corner of her desk. "When I came to Silver Crown, I needed a job. That's the truth. I had enough for maybe 2 more weeks, and Tilly needed a roof, and I took the work that was available." "I know that," she said. "I don't want you to think—" He stopped. "I need you to know that the reason I'm still here is not the same reason I came." Vivian was very still. "The reason I came was the work," he said. "The reason I'm still here is," he looked up, "you. And Tilly, because Tilly made her decision about this place about 4 days in, and I don't think anyone's consulted her since about whether she'd like to be somewhere else." He paused. "And the work. That too. But that's not the first thing anymore." She looked at him across the desk. The lamp was between them again, the same angle as that first night after the association meeting, and he had the same careful quality, choosing every word the way a man crosses uncertain ground, testing each step before trusting his weight to it. "Cade," she said, "I know what you're going to say." "Do you? You're going to say something practical." "I was going to say that I've been in love with you since somewhere around the 3rd fence line," she said. "Which is not practical at all." He looked at her. "That's what I was going to say," she said. "Which one of us was right?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then the 3rd fence line. Eastern boundary. You explained the wire cut, and I started understanding what kind of person you were." "That's very specific. I'm a specific person." He picked up his hat and held it and set it back down. A man burning through the last of his hesitation, which she had learned by now, was not a small thing for him, accusing. Not because he was weak, but because he had learned what it cost when things he trusted didn't hold. She stood up and came around the desk and stopped in front of him, close enough that this was unambiguous. "I am not going to make you a promise I can't back up with evidence," she said. "What I can tell you is that Silver Crown needs a foreman who is also her husband more than it needs a foreman who is not, and that is both the practical answer and the one that keeps me up at night. And I am tired of having 2 different answers to the same question." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he kissed her, which was nothing like the managed, careful thing she might have expected from a man this deliberate. and everything like the real version of him that she'd been watching through fence lines and cattle drives and late nights in the ranch office, direct and certain and completely without performance. When he stepped back, Tilly was in the doorway. She had the particular expression of a child who has known something was going to happen before the adults involved figured it out, and who is being decent enough not to say so explicitly. She looked at her father. She looked at Vivian. She looked at the general state of the situation. Then she walked over to Vivian, took her hand, and placed it inside Cade's, and stepped back. Vivian looked down at Tilly. "Did you plan that?" Tilly's expression was completely innocent. "Planned it," Cade said. They married in the rebuilt Silver Crown barn in late summer, when the heat had come off the days but not yet off the evenings, and the valley was gold and dry in the way that made it look like a painting of itself. The barn still smelled of new lumber. They had not tried to disguise this, had in fact left it as it was, because new wood smelled like something that was going to last. 30 people came, everyone who had stayed, everyone who had helped, the Halter brothers and Eleanor Crane and Shep and Pete and Aldous and Frank and Dottie, who cried without embarrassment and had apparently been planning the food for 2 months. Cade received nothing through the marriage that was not already his by right of work. Vivian kept Silver Crown in her own name, and he had no argument with this, because he had no argument with her. What she owned was hers. What he had was his, and what they were building together was something neither of them could have built alone, and that belonged to both of them, in a way no legal document was equipped to describe. Tilly wore a new dress that she had agreed to with minimal negotiation, and wore with the dignified resignation of a child who understands that some battles are not worth having. She stood beside her father during the ceremony, with one hand in his and one hand free, and at the moment when it was finished, she took Vivian's free hand without being asked. She held both of them. That was all. That was everything. There is something people don't tell you about hard seasons. They change the shape of the good ones that come after. Vivian Harroway. Vivian
Hollister now, though at the association she was
still Harroway, and likely
always would be understood this in the specific way you understand things that have cost you something real.
not the lesson version of understanding, the kind you can repeat back in clean sentences. The other kind. The kind that lives in your hands when you read a brand, in your legs when you ride a fence line, in the place behind your sternum when you look at a pasture full of cattle that are there, because you fought for them. Silver Crown grew. Not immediately, not without difficulty, not in the smooth upward line that people draw on paper when they're planning rather than living. It grew with setbacks, a bad winter that hit the herd harder than expected, a water dispute with a new neighbor that took 6 months and 2 association meetings to resolve. A period in Cade's second year as foreman, when 3 hands left in the same month for better-paying operations, and they were back to managing too much land with too few people. They got through it. Not because they were exceptional, not because luck kept landing on their side, but because they had learned that getting through things was less about the size of the obstacle and more about whether you kept showing up at the same problem the next morning and the morning after that. Tilly learned the ledgers. She was, as Vivian had suspected from the first morning she'd watched those cataloging eyes move through the cattle, extraordinary with numbers, not in a showy way, not in a way she called attention to, but in the way of someone for whom patterns were simply visible that were invisible to others. By the time she was 12, she was doing the quarterly reconciliation without being asked. By 13, she had found 2 errors in the association's shared water accounting that had gone unnoticed for 3 years. She still didn't talk much. She had never become a talker in the way that some quiet children eventually do. But she talked more than she had. She talked to Vivian about the ledgers and the cattle counts. Talked to Cade about horses in the particular technical language they shared that nobody else fully followed. She talked to Shep, who was one of the rare adults who understood that a question asked quietly was still a question and deserved a real answer. She was, all in all, herself, which turned out to be more than enough. In the fall of her second year as association president, Vivian stood at the front of the Grange Hall and proposed a shared water management agreement that would benefit every small operator in the valley equally and remove the possibility of one large player using water access as leverage over others. It was a proposal she'd been building for a year, quietly, carefully, talking to people one at a time, and finding out where they could agree before she put anything formal on the table. It passed by a margin that surprised even her. Riding home that evening, she thought about Bram Kessler in his Casper courtroom, with his good lawyers and his careful records and his complete confidence that the machine he'd built was stronger than any individual inside it. He had not been entirely wrong. Machines are strong. Individual people are unreliable, inconsistent, frightened, self-interested, capable of being bought and pressured and tired out. But machines run on the assumption that the people inside them will keep being whatever they were when the machine was built. They have no provision for what happens when someone decides to be something different. When a woman who was supposed to sign the papers doesn't sign them. When an old hand stays when he could leave. When a silent child puts a found ledger into the right hands. When a room full of men who had been keeping their heads down suddenly has the option to raise them. That was the thing about people that machines could never account for, the decision. The moment when someone who had been going along with something stops going along with it, not because the circumstances changed, but because they themselves changed. Because they got tired of being smaller than they were. Vivian had been smaller than she was for most of the year before that storm, and those 3 knocks on her door. Not weak smaller. Living in a version of herself that was defined by what she'd inherited rather than what she could build. It had taken a man with no money and a silent daughter and almost nothing to his name to show up in the rain and be exactly who he was without apology, and somehow that had been the thing that reminded her she was allowed to do the same. You cannot plan for that kind of help. You can only be the kind of person who recognizes it when it arrives. She rode home through the valley in the October evening, and the light was the particular gold of that season in that place. And she could see Silver Crown from the road, the house, and the barn, and the pastures, and the cattle moving to their evening positions, the whole ordinary, extraordinary thing of a working ranch at the end of a working day. Cade was in the yard when she rode in. He had been fixing the north fence post, the same section, the one that kept working loose no matter how many times they reset it, and he was muddy to the elbow and not done yet. But he looked up when she came through the gate. "How'd it go?" he called. "It passed," she said. He nodded. Went back to the post. She rode to the stable and unsaddled her own horse and put the mare up properly, the whole process, the way she always did it now. Tilly was in the tack room. She looked up when Vivian came in. "It passed," Vivian told her. Tilly nodded. She already knew, in the way she often knew things before people told her. She had probably calculated the likely vote from the conversation she'd overheard at the last 3 association meetings. Vivian hung up the saddle and stood in the tack room for a moment. On the shelf behind her, the 3rd shelf up, the one Tilly had first reached behind on the day she was 10 years old and found a hidden book in a place a grown man would never look, there was a small framed document. Nothing formal. Just a piece of paper in a cheap frame that Dottie had put together as a wedding gift because she thought it deserved to be visible. It was Cade Hollister's original 30-day employment contract. Signed November something. Compensation listed. Terms simple. At the bottom, Vivian's signature, written in the rushed hand of a woman who was running on 2 hours of sleep and too much coffee, and a determination not to be defeated by a person who thought her silk dresses were a summary of her character. She looked at it. Silver Crown had survived because Bram Kessler made the mistake that powerful people reliably make. He assumed that what he saw was all there was. He saw an heiress who had never run a ranch. He saw silk dresses and a grief-dazed face and a woman who didn't know the difference between a Watergate adjusted correctly and one adjusted to favor someone else's land. He did not see what she would become when the situation required it. He did not see the cowboy who would teach her without humiliating her. He did not see the 9-year-old girl who walked through tack rooms and looked at things at eye level because she had never been told to look above or below. He saw a machine he'd built and the pieces inside it and the levers he controlled. He did not see people deciding. That was the whole of it. That was the lesson. If there was one, which Vivian was not entirely sure there was, she was skeptical of lessons, which tended to be tidier than the events they were drawn from. But if she had to say what the year had taught her, it was this. The thing that could not be stolen was the thing she had to earn herself. The cattle could go back in the valley. The water rights could be signed away. The crew could walk out. The suppliers could cut her off. All of that could be taken. And underneath all of that, irreducible, was just her. What she knew, what she was willing to do, what she refused to stop being when it would have been easier to stop. That was hers. Permanently. Bram-proof. She looked at the contract for one more moment. Then she went out of the tack room and across the yard to where her husband was still working on the fence post in the failing light, and she crouched down beside him and held the post steady so the reset would hold. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said. "Hold the bracket." He held the bracket. They finished the fence together as the dark came in over Silver Crown, and the cattle settled, and the stars came out one at a time over Red Willow Valley, and the night was cold and ordinary and exactly what it was supposed to be.